Duke Cullen de Levelton, who held all the power and wealth in the kingdom, was the main character of the Levelton family story. The girl looked at the man, thinking how after being reborn, she'd become just a poor background character in this novel. Cullen asked the little girl if she wanted to be his adopted daughter, but terrified, she clutched her dress, thinking this luck felt like a dream where something bad was about to happen. The Duke stared at the girl, surprised she wasn't answering his offer. The man narrowed his eyes, trying to figure out what was wrong with the girl in front of him. The little girl looked at the man with fear, but all she could think about was that she knew the story of this novel, and in it, the Duke was a stone-cold killer. Some time ago, before meeting the Duke, the little girl was sitting with a newspaper, trying to read a want ad for maids. Walter sat down next to the girl, surprised she was reading the newspaper when she couldn't even read well. The girl threw the newspaper on the ground and yelled at her friend that she knew a few letters. The kids were sitting on the ground by the wall when the little girl shared her idea with her friend. She didn't want to stay poor her whole life, and to change her fate, she needed to find a job and a place to live. The girl kept scanning the newspaper for jobs, while Walter wondered aloud about fate and if you could change it. But his friend told him to quit distracting her, because changing fate was tough and she needed to focus. The kid remembered being all alone on the streets after her mom died, having to beg strangers for handouts in the market square. Once, a young couple gave her a loaf of bread, and her friends swore that people helped her out because she was so darn cute. The girl took the food from rich folks without a second thought, because she and her friends were working together. Some of the kids spotted the rich guys, and she turned on the charm. After a successful run, the kids happily shared the food and ate the bread together. The boy called the girl's name and tapped her on the shoulder. Lee snapped out of her memories and grumbled at him not to bother her. Walter pointed and guessed that the tall dude in the crowd looked like he was loaded. Lee scanned the crowd, and her eyes landed on a guy in a red cap who was rushing somewhere. Her friend pointed out another guy who was wearing a black cloak. Lee jumped to her feet, her mood brightening, as she told the boy she'd handle it from here. Little did she know, this meeting would change her whole life. The little girl quietly approached the man and gently tugged on his cloak, asking for a single coin. The man turned at the sound of her voice, radiating the aura of someone important, and Le immediately knew he was incredibly handsome. In the next instant, the man casually pushed the girl aside, demanding she move because he was busy. From the shove, Le stumbled, and suddenly her mind was flooded with strange memories. A memory surfaced in the girl's mind, showing a doctor talking to two adults. The memory shifted, and now a girl was observing the conversation from inside a hospital room. The memories kept changing, and now, Lee saw the girl in the hospital room reading a book about the daily life of the Levelton family, realizing it was her, but in a past life. Suddenly, an image from the novel flashed in her mind. Duke Levelton walking through a crowd, searching for a criminal and worried he might escape on a train. The image changed to a man in a red cap, who was actually the criminal, but the Duke didn't suspect it yet. Lee sank deeper into her memories, now recalling another chapter of the novel, where the criminal hid his face behind the cap and disappeared into a crowd of beggars. The scattered pieces of the novel kept playing out, and now Cullen was racing towards the train station. But while the Duke was hurrying to the station, some lowlife was causing trouble among the poor, and a kid named Walter got caught in the crossfire. Suddenly, all the weird memories vanished, and Leah was back in her own head, standing in the middle of the marketplace. Leah overheard the Duke cursing about not being able to find the culprit, and she got scared that the events from that book she saw were about to happen, meaning Walter was in danger. The girl ran back to Cullen and grabbed his black cloak with all her might. Leah screamed in terror, telling the man not to go to the station, or a lot of people would get hurt. The little girl was still tugging on the man's cloak, desperately trying to explain that there was a weird guy in a red cap in the square who pretended to go to the station, but then disappeared into an alley. Cullen looked at the girl with doubt when she told him that the stranger looked like the wanted demon killer, William, from the posters. Leah started panicking, shouting and agreeing with everything the man asked, hoping he'd hurry and run to the alley. The Duke spun around and bolted from the city's main street into a small alleyway. Suddenly, loud screams echoed from the alley, and a lot of people in the crowd looked over, surprised at what was happening around the corner. Lee ran to the corner of the building and carefully peeked into the alley, making sure she wasn't spotted. In the alley, the girl saw the Duke using dark magic, which surrounded the criminal on all sides. With a flick of his wrist, Cullen shifted the magic, and it slammed the wanted murderer to the ground. The man walked up to the villain and pinned him to the ground with his foot, then whispered that this was incredibly satisfying. Cullen, his eyes burning, stared at his defeated enemy and, with a flourish of his cane, confessed he'd gladly be rid of such scum. Lee covered her ears in horror as the sounds of fighting and screams filled the alley. The girl opened her eyes a crack when the silence came, but she was still thinking that the man in the cloak might be completely unhinged. Cullen stood in the alley, his face relaxed after catching the killer, and he casually tossed his hair back. However, thick drops of blood dripped from the cane, proof that the killer wouldn't be hurting anyone ever again. The girl was freaked out by what she saw and stumbled back, legs shaking, desperately trying to figure out how to escape. Whipping around, the girl bolted towards the crowded street, running as fast as she could. Suddenly, a strong hand grabbed her by the collar, yanking her aside before she could even scream. Cullen pinned the kid against the wall, giving her the once-over while she choked and gasped for air after his rough grip. The guy had to grab her shoulders and shake her a little to calm her down enough to answer his questions. Lee was trembling like a leaf, totally terrified, and all she could do was beg him to let her go. Cullen barely managed to crouch down when police shouts echoed from the street, ordering everyone to check the alley. The man quickly shoved a gold card into the girl's hand, implying there were too many eyes around for them to talk freely. The Duke shot into the air, smoke swirling around him, identifying himself as Cullen Levelton and telling the girl to come find him. 1 second he was gone, and the next thing she knew, cops were all around. But she didn't even notice, too busy staring at the card in her hand. After a seriously messed up day, Lee crashed out on the sidewalk, using a newspaper and a ratty blanket as cover. Even in her sleep, she was haunted by the fact she was stuck in some novel's world, reborn as a nobody extra living in the gutter. Lee's sleep was restless. She was scared she'd end up dying poor and never get to enjoy anything this new world had to offer. Lee started dreaming her parents from her past life were hugging her, begging that she be born healthy and happy in her next life. Looks like all she got was the healthy part. Morning came, and Lee reluctantly woke up, stretching her arms a little after a super uncomfortable night on the ground. The girl looked around, totally surprised to see a bunch of red flower petals scattered all over her newspaper. Lee was checking out the flowers, but then her eyes locked onto the letters in the newspaper. She squinted, trying to figure out where she'd seen them before. Suddenly, she pulled out that gold business card and started comparing the text on it to the newspaper. Then it hit her. The lettering was exactly the same on both. The girl got so hyped up by her hunch that she started flipping through the newspapers, searching for a specific ad. Lee clenched her fists, stoked, when she read in the paper that the Duke Levelton family was looking for maids. This was her shot, a real chance to change her fate. The guard, looking bored as hell, double-checked if Lee really got that business card directly from the Duke himself. Lei was dead set on her plan, so she confidently announced that the Duke gave her his card and asked her to come see him. The guard wasn't buying it. He kept squinting at the card, making Lei worry he'd think she was lying, when suddenly a carriage showed up at the gates. The courtyard went silent. Then you heard this loud screech as the carriage rolled up to the gate. The carriage stopped and outstepped this dark-haired dude, who Liu started checking out, surprised. The guy looked a lot like Duke Cullen, with the same ruby-red eyes and that proud posture. But when he got to the gate, he's like, "What the heck's going on here?" Lei was still giving the stranger the once-over when the guard told him she claimed she was here to see the Duke at his request. The guy turned his attention to the girl and was surprised his old man had a new interest. But while he was sizing up Lei, she figured out he was Jade, the Duke's son. The girl steeled herself again and declared that she needed to see the Duke. She had something important to talk to him about. Jade wasn't fazed. The dude opened the gate, strolled calmly into the courtyard, and told the girl to follow him. A couple minutes later, Jade and Lei were in the mansion's hallway, where Lord Cullen, standing in the open doorway of the living room, noticed them and looked surprised they'd arrived. The Duke cast a careful eye on the guest who'd arrived at his mansion. Jade walked into the room, but Lei remained timidly standing in the doorway, a worried look in his eyes. Jade stood next to his father and asked if he really knew this girl, because she had a gold-plated business card that she could have stolen, but his father admitted that he knew the girl, and he was in her debt. The son cast a curious glance at the guest, wondering if his father had actually invited her into their home. Lei finally got a grip on her nerves and dared to ask if they were looking for maids at this house. The girl got scared when the Duke asked why she was interested, so Lei confessed that she'd seen a newspaper ad about hiring help. Lei's voice trembled. She nervously clenched her fingers and said that since she'd helped the Duke, maybe the Duke could help her too. Cullen sat calmly in his armchair and, just out of curiosity, asked how old the girl was, to which Lei modestly answered 9 years old. Suddenly, Lei got scared that she was too young and quickly began to explain to the Duke that she was very strong and healthy for her age, so she could eat once a day and do any job. The girl looked at her hands and declared that she could scrub floors until they shone, using different rags and soapy water. But Lei thought that wasn't enough and suddenly declared that because of her small size, she could squeeze into the pipe and clean the chimney. The girl was distracted from her story by footsteps, and a young woman appeared in the living room, surprised by the little one's abilities, and introduced herself as Marianne. Lei was struck by how much more beautiful Cullen's younger sister was in person than in the novel. Marianne knelt down next to the girl and kindly asked about her parents and where she lived. Lei honestly replied that she had lost her mother several years ago and lived wherever she could. Jade had been listening to the girl's stories the whole time, so he couldn't help but ask where she slept if she didn't have a home. Lei was scared she'd be kicked out and quickly started saying that she wasn't carrying any diseases because the alley she slept in was clean, and at night she just covered herself with discarded blankets. The girl finished her story, and everyone fell silent, which made her feel awkward. Marianne listened to the story and became interested in why the girl wanted to work as a servant, since she could ask for something more in return for helping the Duke. Lee walked up to the girl sitting in the armchair and confessed that with this job, she would become different. And when she grew up, she would no longer live in poverty. All of a sudden, Lee's mood dropped. She hesitantly clutched the hem of her dirty dress and whispered that she dreamed of changing her fate, of living a normal life, so no one would ever belittle or kick her around again. Marianne knelt down next to the girl and gently stroked her head. The girl praised Lee for her fighting spirit, and the little one confessed that she didn't know who else to turn to. The lady was checking out the girl when her gaze landed on a small red flower petal in one of Leah's hair strands. Leah pulled out a few flowers and offered them to Marianne as a gift. But suddenly, the Duke tensed up. Cullen kept his eyes glued to the girl, trying to keep his voice steady as he demanded to know where she got those flowers. The girl gave the flowers to the man's outstretched hand, worried she'd be seen as a thief, and quickly explained that she found the flowers next to her when she woke up. Leah remembered a boy who sells flowers on the street and donates the leftovers to orphans, and guessed that her friends might have left the flowers next to her. Marianne wasn't really interested in the flower story and decided to find out how much money the girl wanted for the job, to which the little one quickly assured her that she'd take whatever they gave her, or a quarter of an adult's salary. Duke Cullen started examining the flower, but his gaze was wary and he wasn't really listening to the conversation. Leah was worried that the lady wasn't responding to her offers, so she decided to suggest an even lower price for the work. Suddenly, the Duke turned to the girl and demanded she tell the truth about how she knew he was chasing a killer in the streets. Leah was confident, because she'd made up a lie in advance, so without hesitation, she repeated that she'd seen the criminal on wanted posters about dangerous individuals. Cullen thoughtfully twirled the flower in his hands, still unconvinced by her answer, and pressed her on why she'd picked him out of the whole crowd. Lee stood before him, flustered. She couldn't figure out why he was grilling her, so she blurted out some lame excuse about it being a total coincidence. The Duke doubted her story, but then Lee turned on the charm, flashed a sweet smile, and with childlike innocence, explained that he'd caught her eye on the street because he was so handsome, and she never guessed he was a high-ranking noble. Cullen fell for the girl's trick and didn't press further, only asking how she knew about his plans for the train station. Lee stuck to her script, assuring him that he was well-dressed, and people like that don't usually have a reason to be running around in dirty alleys. The girl's imagination kicked into high gear, and she quickly fabricated a story about how the fastest way to the train station was cutting through the alleys. The Duke smirked, impressed by the little girl's resourcefulness. Lee went silent, secretly hoping she'd managed to throw him off her trail. Cullen rose from his chair and gestured towards the door, telling her to wait out there while he held a family meeting. As soon as the kid slipped into the hallway, all the strength drained from her body, and she slumped onto a bench with a sigh, hoping she hadn't screwed things up with the Duke. The wait was agonizing, so Lo clasped her hands in silent prayer, hoping they'd take her on for any dirty job they'd trust her with. In the living room, Marianne calmly weighed the girl's fate and suggested taking her in. Jade was stressed by the whole situation, but advised his aunt not to treat the kid like a house pet. The woman took her nephew's words to heart and snapped back that in her temple, the girl could eat properly and get an education. Cullen was totally focused on the flower, but jumped into the family's conversation because he didn't want the girl ending up as a nun. The family was surprised by Cullen's statement, and Marianne started worrying about the rumors that would spread about their family if such a young servant appeared in their house. The Duke couldn't help himself and offered to take the girl in and raise her as part of their family, but Jade didn't approve of his father's joke. Suddenly, Cullen crushed the red flower with all his might, and it crumbled into petals. The Duke brushed the remains of the plant off his glove, then declared with a sly smile that he wasn't kidding. Leigh was invited into the living room, and now she sensed the situation was even more tense than before. Cullen dropped the bomb that the maids were already hired, and you could see the pure despair wash over Lee's face. The girl hung her head, dark thoughts swarming her brain as she started blaming herself for getting her hopes up. The Duke wasn't moved by her sadness, and just said if she was willing to do whatever they told her, she'd get 5 gold coins a week. The pay blew Lee away, and she immediately started picturing how much bread she could buy. But the joy faded, replaced by worry, as Lee realized she wasn't going to get that kind of money for nothing. Her mind raced, and she suddenly imagined the Duke had a hobby of making taxidermied animals, and she'd soon be standing in line with the rest of his collection. Cullen saw the girl's confusion and calmly said that they never had daughters in their family, and offered to make the kid their adopted daughter. Lee lit up, figuring it was just some kind of servant role in this house, and nobody was really going to adopt her. Marianne laughed so hard she cried, and promised Lee that she wouldn't be the servant anymore. She'd be served. The girl's head spun from the sudden realization that she was actually going to become a daughter in this family. Marianne scooted closer to her brother, complaining he didn't know how to talk about things right, and now the kid thought it was going to be her job. A dull thud echoed from the door. Then it creaked open, and the butler appeared with news that the prince was waiting to meet with the Duke. Callan's response was icy, demanding he not be disturbed while he was talking with family. Lo flinched at the master's cold tone, realizing the Levelton family might be more powerful than the royals. Suddenly, the Duke stroked the girl's hair, promising she wouldn't have to work while she was so young. The girl looked at him expectantly, but the man added to his promise, assuring her she wouldn't live on the streets and could stay in his home. Lei was shaken by the unbelievable request, clutching the hem of her dress tightly when she heard the Duke ask her to be his daughter again. The girl imagined gaining the status of the country's most noble lady, her life sparkling with bright colors. But her fantasy was clouded by the thought that the Levelton family had a lot of dark secrets she'd be dragged into. Lei hid her face in her hair and shook her head. She didn't know how much joy or misery this opportunity would bring, but it was a once-in-a-lifetime chance. Cullen waited patiently for her answer. Le's heart hammered in her chest, but she steeled herself and said she accepted his offer. The Duke stood up from his chair, relieved that everything was settled. He took it upon himself to inform the butler of the situation. The man headed off to meet with the prince, but Marianne was outraged he didn't even bother to ask the girl's name. The Duke just said he'd give her one himself. His indifference stung. With a mix of nervousness and defiance, she declared that her name was Lee, and her mother gave it to her. Those sudden words stopped the Duke dead in his tracks. The man guessed that, with a name like that, she must have been born on a Monday, and his assumption threw the little girl for a loop. Lei was filled with questions, but the man was already focused on something else. He just looked at her and said he knew an ancient language where her name meant Monday. A little while later, a bath was prepared for Lo in one of the manor's rooms. The little girl cautiously tested the water temperature with her toe. Lee peeked out from behind the curtain to check out the bathroom, which was huge compared to the living room and packed with all kinds of lamps. The girl ducked back behind the curtain when the butler appeared and said the maids would be there soon to help her. But Lo asked him not to leave. The butler introduced himself as Cheyenne and promised to answer all of Lo's questions after she took a bath. The little one cautiously peeked through the curtain and still asked what it meant to be an adopted daughter. Cheyenne promised he would take care of her now, since she was one of the mistresses of the house. But that wasn't enough for Lee, and the butler decided they needed to have a serious talk. The butler decided to enlighten Le about the world of the wealthy and how aristocratic families sometimes, though rarely, have adopted children. But usually, aristocrats take such a step so their only children don't spend all their time alone. Noble families sometimes see this as charity, to give orphans a good education and upbringing. Some aristocrats train the children and turn them into masters of a certain skill. But in the end, if a little lady appears in the family, everyone will start praising the Duke and his family's benevolence. Lee listened carefully to Cheyenne's story. A plan was already forming in her head to repay the Duke if she became a girl worthy of praise. Suddenly, Lei's fantasies shifted to dark figures, and a voice in her head said that in the world of the streets, where predators roam, a little girl's chance of survival is next to nothing. The girl hugged her knees, continuing to soak in the tub, figuring even being seen as a charity case by the Levelton family was okay now that she wouldn't starve and could get an education. Cheyenne realized his charity talk might have been harsh, but he bowed anyway, promising to take even better care of Lou. The butler, trying to lighten the mood, admitted the Duke was a closed-off guy who didn't like everyone, though Lee already knew Cullen had a dark past. Cheyenne quietly slipped through the slightly open door, and as he left, confessed that the most important thing now was for Lo to grow up safe and sound. The door slammed shut, and La tried to relax in the tub, but her thoughts were a mess, knowing she was now the daughter of a killer and wondering how she could ever live a peaceful, healthy life. Lei tried to recall the memories she had from her past life, where, in the novel, Cullen wasn't just a killer, but the strongest mage in the last 500 years, cursed to kill. The novel's story was that after the curse, Cullen had to sustain his life by drawing on dark energy, but this caused a mana absorption sickness, and the Duke gained new powers. When the kid got cursed, the family decided to weaponize his abilities and got the royal family involved. And years later, due to the influence of high-ranking families, a villain named Cullen Levelton emerged. A villain who kills villains, becoming a #1 special ops tool. The fragmented memories ended, and Lou decided to enjoy the hot bath while things weren't too dangerous yet, because Cullen might turn out to be a decent guy, maybe even like a hero. A few bangs echoed from behind the curtain, and Lee jumped. The room started filling up with maids carrying tons of bath stuff. Caught off guard, Lee almost went completely under, and could only watch the staff with embarrassment. One of the maids already rolled up her sleeve, grabbed a bath sponge, and headed towards the girl to help her wash up. After a while, Lee stood wrapped in a clean towel, her hair gleaming in the lamplight. The girl looked at the bathwater, which was now horribly black after she'd been cleaned, and she felt ashamed. But the maid just reassured her. Lee examined the towel, wondering why they used such soft fabrics on her body. After the bath, the maids picked out a clean dress for the girl, and she looked like a little mistress from an aristocratic family. The little one happily looked at her hair in the mirror, because now it was a vibrant color. After that, the girl started twirling in her dress, and the maids breathed a sigh of relief that the young miss liked everything. One of the maids pulled the little one away from checking out the clothes and invited her to the dining room for dinner. Lo came to the dining room, where the table was already set, but she was the only one there. The girl walked closer to get a better look at what was on the table. After thinking for a moment, she climbed onto one of the high chairs. Now Lo could see the appetizing food up close. She hadn't seen so many treats before, and her eyes were full of wonder. Suddenly, Lay's stomach started making weird noises. She tried to calm it down and waited for everyone to come for dinner. 20 minutes passed. Lay kept her eyes glued to the table the whole time, and her mouth was watering from all the food. Getting a little bolder, the little one picked up a small roll and wondered if she could have a little taste. Lo couldn't resist and tried a piece of the pastry. She was shocked that it had been so long since she'd eaten something so delicious. Suddenly, she remembered her past life, when she spent so much time in the hospital, which made her lose her appetite. Even after being reborn, she barely ate. All that amazing food at Liu's place really worked up my appetite. I was chilling in the dining room, just trying everything on the plates. Then Jade shows up next to the table, totally blown away by how much I could put away for someone so small. I was so startled, I dropped my chicken leg and was like, "When did you get here for dinner?" But he didn't even notice I was flustered. He just pointed out I was sitting in his chair. I jumped in my seat, totally freaked out. I didn't want him to get the wrong impression of me. All that sudden movement made the chair wobble, and I started to fall. Jade reacted quick though, and grabbed me before the chair completely tipped over. He gently sat me back down and smoothed out my clothes. After that, he pulled up a chair next to me and said I could stay where I was. Jade looked at my hair, surprised, because it was all shiny after the bath. The guy caught a whiff of the soap she was using and realized that Le smelled like strawberry blonde. Lo was embarrassed by his behavior and looked away at the table, which was empty. Jade noticed her sadness and tried to figure out what was bumming her out. Le still remembered how she and her friends always shared food on the streets. That was their survival code, and they never broke it to avoid becoming thieves. Now that Lo was in a new home, she wanted to be friends with the young master. But after what happened, she was afraid he'd think she was a glutton. The guy brushed that off easily and told Lei to chill, because he'd been watching her eat. Le thought that was weird, but the guy promised he was just curious, because after seeing her, he figures she really can get by on eating once a day. The guy's words stung Lee, because she used to have nothing to eat, and now she was worried that Jade had the wrong idea about her. Jade put more food next to Lei and told her to eat as much as she wants, because when she's eating, she looks like Popo. Jade remembered that Popo was his cat, who, just like Lee, loved a good meal and always ate more than she probably should have. The girl looked questioningly at the piece of pie in her hand, while Jade was still happily reminiscing about his pet. Lee abruptly put her food down when the guy admitted he really loved his pet. Before, it passed on. Suddenly, Jade changed the subject and offered to show Lee Popo's, memorial, which totally freaked the little girl out. Lee sipped her juice and, just out of curiosity, tried to find out what happened to Popo, because now she was kinda creeped out by the guy. Jade confessed that he was doing research at the time. He kept Popo comfortable and cared for her, but the cat's time was coming, and nothing he did could change that. The guy's story changed Lee's impression of him, and she tried to remember something else from the books. Her imagination conjured up a page from the book, stating that Jade shuns people and lives in his own world, where even Cullen can't get in. Lee gave the guy a sweet smile, because he turned out to be just like in the book, but also a good person who knows how to care for someone. The guy moved closer, wondering why Lee wanted to be friends with him. Lee confessed she stayed here because of him. If he was against it, the Duke would have kicked her out, but Cullen values his precious son's opinion. What she said really got the guy thinking. Another round of food hit the table, and Jade said brothers and sisters can't be friends, which bummed Lee out. But Jade didn't tease her. He just smiled and told her they could definitely get closer, especially since he'd be seeing her around all the time with that appetite of hers. While things were chill between them, the guy decided to pump the little one for info and turned to her. He gave her a sweet smile and asked if she really got those red flowers from someone. Jade's words threw the little girl for a loop. She remembered the Duke and how freaked out he was by the flowers she gave him. Lee tried one more time to convince Jade she didn't steal those flowers. The guy rubbed his chin, lost in thought. He was bugged by why his father decided to adopt the little kid. Then Jade just drops the bomb that Lee might be a killer, or at least helped someone off someone, and it totally freaked the kid out. The girl was shaking her head like crazy, swearing nobody died because of her. But Jade pushed her to talk about any bad things she'd done, which just made her start fidgeting with her dress again. Lee told him about the time she got accused of stealing a wallet, and one of the adults decided to punish her for it. The bad memories made Lee rub her cheek, and she promised Jade she was going to give the wallet back. It just fell out of someone's pocket. Hearing that bummed the kid out, and he started to feel for her. Lee didn't want to dig up the past, but she decided to be straight with Jade that she took a few hits that day. Her answer satisfied him, and he finally realized the girl wasn't just some pawn of his dad's. Lee figured out this whole thing was a test to see what his dad was really up to. Jade asked her point blank if she remembered the guy who laid a hand on her, but Lee couldn't recall anything about it anymore. The guy flashed a charming smile and told the girl to let him know if she ever remembers that lowlife, and he'd make him pay for what he did to her. His enthusiasm didn't exactly thrill her, but she just gave him a sweet smile back. Late night had fallen over the estate. In a secret room, crammed with weapons, the butler's voice echoed. Cheyenne read out the report on Lou's life before she came to the Levelton household. The girl's story checked out, and the data in the report confirmed it. Cullen sat in his chair, looking bored. When Cheyenne finished the report, assuring the Duke that Lei wasn't a threat, he was still intrigued why he'd adopted her. The guy knew there weren't flowers like that anywhere else in the country, so this wasn't just some random thing. The Duke remembered when his mother was murdered. The killer left a ton of red morning glories as a taunt. The butler understood the Duke's plan, thought about Le and the potential trap, while the Duke was already figuring she was either a victim or an accomplice of that killer. Cheyenne flipped through the report again, still finding nothing weird, even though Cullen had told him to pay extra attention to the details. There was a rustling sound near the Duke's feet. While he was discussing Jade's behavior with Cheyenne, the Duke told him to leave his son alone. Cullen looked down at the floor, where a tied-up man's body lay next to his chair. Cheyenne apologized, but he must have miscalculated the dosage. The guy didn't pass out. Cullen coolly pinned the perp's head with his foot and asked about the victims he'd hurt. Cheyenne admitted he hadn't finished the job yet, couldn't return the bodies to their families. But the Duke was already figuring out what to do with this killer. Cullen decided to scare the crap out of him, started describing how he'd tear him apart and send the pieces to the victims' families as a gift. The butler slipped a dark glove onto his master's hand, and the room filled with raspy moans. The Duke slammed the killer's head back down, and the guy let out a terrified groan. Cheyenne smirked at the killer and assured the Duke his plan was more than enough punishment. Then came a sickening crack of bones. Lai was dreaming again, about her past in a hospital room, where she was always reading books. Despite her illness, she was a cheerful kid and dreamed of catching bad guys when she grew up. Connecting with her family made her happy, especially how her parents supported her dreams. But the time came when her health started failing, and her parents were freaking out. At that point, the Levelton family book was the last thing she'd read. Morning came, and Lei woke up to bright sunlight, remembering her dream about the past. The little girl looked at the window, but she was still hung up on why she had so few memories of the Levelton family book's story. Lei glanced around her chambers, glowing green in the sunlight, and realized she was doubting reality more and more each day. The girl sharply pinched her cheeks to make sure she wasn't still asleep. A little later, Le rushed into the dining room, wearing new clothes, and wished Jade a good morning as she ran. The guy greeted her at the dining table. The family tucked into breakfast, but the Duke wasn't there. Jade said he'd left to inspect the estates. That answer was good enough for Lei, especially since they'd already put plates of food in front of her. But she secretly suspected the Duke was up to no good, and the estate inspection was just a cover. The kids were eating breakfast, and like the past few days, Jade was watching over Lo again. The little one noticed how close they'd gotten lately, calling each other by their first names now. Liat with gusto, but decided it was time to learn some table manners, even though she immediately wiped her mouth with her sleeve. She wanted to know Jade's plans, but he already had to head to the academy. She was bummed that they wouldn't be able to hang out. Jade glanced at the butler, like they were cooking something up. Suddenly, Cheyenne was behind Lei, holding out a yellow balloon to cheer her up. The little kid was stoked and carefully started playing with the gift. All of a sudden, she remembered the past again. Like in the hospital, when her parents gave her a bunch of blue balloons to make her feel better. Jade knelt down next to her, because Lo started crying. But she admitted that she was happy now. The guy stroked her hair as she thanked him for the gift, promising to always keep the little trinket with her. The butler brought in a teapot and poured the hot drink into cups. Lei took a sip of the mountain tea. Breakfast continued in the dining room, everyone enjoying the perfect start to the day. Cheyenne decided to give Lei a tour of the estate, mentioning how the building held stories of generations past. He led Lo to the garden. She already knew the Levelton family was the oldest in the empire, owning vast territories. Lo carefully held the trinket as Cheyenne pointed out which houses belonged to the Duke's family, even though most relatives had moved away. Suddenly, Cheyenne pointed towards an old temple. Lei looked over as Cheyenne warned her not to go near it, saying it housed the Duke's collectibles. But Lo knew it was actually his study. The rumble of carriage wheels echoed on the road. The girl looked around, startled, trying to figure out where that loud noise came from. A carriage, emblazoned with the temple's crest, was tearing into the estate grounds. Lee got spooked and clung to Cheyenne, who just gave her a reassuring squeeze. The carriage screeched to a halt right next to Lee and Cheyenne. The noise was deafening. Marianne jumped out, beaming, clearly happy to see them, though Cheyenne wasn't thrilled with the grand entrance. She walked up to him and told him that society was buzzing with rumors about the Duke's adopted daughter. The butler was fuming because they hadn't managed to bury all the news articles. Marianne smirked, amused that gossip travels faster than print these days. She reminisced about all the noble ladies who were always keeping a close eye on the Empire's eligible Duke. Lee was eavesdropping on the grown-up conversation when Marianne started bragging about all the ladies who came to her with questions. But Lee got hooked on the name Lady Rose. Marianne's eyes landed on Lee, and she was visibly shocked by what she was wearing. Lee checked out her stuff, while Marianne threw a fit about the old-fashioned dress. The lady was pissed that her brother hadn't prepped for having a sweet little girl living in their house now. Cheyenne informed the lady that the Duke wasn't home, so Marianne hugged Lee and decided to take her along. The lady led Lee to the carriage, and Cheyenne started protesting that she needed the Duke's permission. Marianne didn't sweat the butler's yelling and asked the little one how old she was. The lady got flustered that Lee called her madam and asked her to just use her name. Marianne unleashed a furious rant at the butler, saying the kid could pick her own clothes, and if the Duke wanted to see them, he could find them in the dressing room. The man calmly agreed to hand the girl over to the lady. The lady's carriage took off for the city, and Marianne remembered their first meeting. Lee sat quietly by the window, hugging a yellow ball, while the lady showered her with compliments about her cute face. The lady was thrilled with the little one and apologized that they didn't get to know each other during their last encounter. Marianne started explaining that she worked at the temple and was one of the local saints. Lei was completely floored and couldn't help but gasp when she realized the lady was the very saint everyone worshipped in the empire. The lady was chatting about future shopping trips and then suddenly pulled out a cigarette. Lee wrinkled her nose at the harsh smell, but figured saints had their own rules, and smoking wasn't off limits there. Marianne apologized and put the cigarette out. The lady gently stroked Lou's hair, and the girl started to believe she wasn't a bad person after all. The carriage arrived on the main street of the capital city. Lei was amazed, taking in the street from the window. The kid remembered back when she was dirt poor. She'd stare at the toy store and think it was the height of luxury. Sometimes, when the store owner was in a bad mood, he'd chase them off the street. But Lee didn't run far, and when the owner forgot to turn off the display window lights, she'd come back to the store. She spent the whole time until dawn just gazing at the counter full of those beautiful toys. Lee followed the store with her eyes through the carriage window. The little girl looked at her mistress and wondered if maybe, just maybe, they could go to the store together. Marianne gently stroked the girl while she was dreaming about touching those toy dolls. The carriage arrived at a fancy clothing store, the kind where all the ladies go hunting for outfits. The mistress led Lee to the entrance and started rattling on about how many clothes she needed and for what events. As soon as they walked into the store, the saleswomen were ecstatic that the saintly lady herself had arrived. Suddenly, all the employees rushed over to the mistress and greeted her like a VIP. The women started fussing over her, asking what she wanted to buy, while Lee hid behind the hem of her dress. Marianne pointed at Lo and asked them to pick out an outfit for her. But the girl was still worried about getting kicked out of this place. The saleswomen tried to figure out who Lei was, and they totally freaked when Marianne introduced the girl as a member of the Leverton family. Lee didn't want to come out from behind the lady while the adults were talking about how much the clothes cost. The employees' words pissed Marianne off, and she threatened them, saying you don't mess with the Leverton family budget. The saleswoman got scared by Marianne's words and started apologizing like crazy. The lady was happy with what she said and ordered them to get everything ready for 100 gold coins. Lee heard the amount of money for the clothes and started counting on her fingers. Kinda awkwardly, how much money that would be if she worked as a maid. Suddenly realizing how much money it was, Lo yelled for the lady not to spend it. But Marianne calmed the little one down. But Lei was already imagining the Duke throwing her out when he found out how much money was spent, even though she's not even their real daughter. Lei hid behind the lady's dress again, but now she was terrified of being kicked out. The saleswomen were all smiles at the girl, promising they had tons of clothes perfect for a young lady, but Lo got suspicious that now even the staff wanted to help with shopping. Suddenly, one of the women snatched the balloon from Lo's hand, leaving the girl confused. But the woman promised to take good care of it. The staff member tied the balloon to the window so it wouldn't get in the way of picking out new outfits. After that, the saleswomen, along with Marianne, led Lou to the fitting rooms, figuring they needed to find the right size clothes to start with. Marianne watched them pick out dresses, but decided to have the saleswomen bring something more expensive. The lady was bored, flipping through a magazine while the staff scurried off for new items, because she didn't want to put cheap stuff on the little one. Suddenly, she perked up when she spotted a new dress in the magazine, and one saleswoman happily announced that this dress was available to try on. The woman escorted Lou to the fitting room for VIP guests. The pink dress was a perfect fit, and the staff member explained that the dress was meant for formal balls, and the princess herself had ordered a similar one. But her words worried Lou more and more, because her dress being similar to one the princess has sounded way too unbelievable. A door clicked open in the hallway outside the fitting room, and one of the staff greeted Lady Rose. Lei paused, distracted by the sound, and remembered Marianne mentioning that name. But suddenly, Lady Rose's annoyed shout echoed from the hallway, demanding that her maids attend to her personally. Lady Rose continued her rant, now furious that the Duke had taken in an adopted daughter when she planned to marry him. The employee helping her with the clothes froze, tense. Rose was more interested in gossip than trying on the dress, so she started speculating whether Cullen's adopted daughter had magical abilities like Jade. Lei eavesdropped on the conversation and remembered Marianne talking about rumors in the estate courtyard, and the girl realized that aristocrats always looked down on people. But the lady was too angry to end the discussion. Now she was worried about how the Duke would educate his adopted daughter. But her maid chimed in and suggested that Rose should marry off the Duke's daughter at a convenient time and send her to the countryside. The lady laughed at the suggestion and decided that the Duke's adopted daughter would have to be a real looker to get anywhere, although she hadn't heard that she was ugly. However, the Duke's tastes are particular, and he only has good taste in women. Lee stood in her fitting room, listening to the gossip about herself, so her mood soured when the lady shouted that she could always sell the Duke's adopted daughter to some less-than-ideal situation. The shop assistant suggested the girl leave the fitting room early to avoid running into the lady in the hallway. Lee stared at the door and imagined shadowy figures of cruel people. She knew she'd met people like Lady before, people who looked down on her because of her poor background. The little girl cracked open the door, deciding that what people thought of her didn't matter right now. Marianne was absolutely thrilled when she saw Lee in her new outfit. The shop assistant suggested the ladies pick out matching outfits, and that idea made Marianne even happier, because she'd always dreamed of wearing things like that with a girl from her family. Lee smiled sweetly again, happy to see Marianne so happy. They sat the girl down in a chair, and the employee asked her to wait while she brought the young lady some water. Lee turned to the window to make sure her balloon was okay, but it turned out the window was wide open, and the balloon she'd tied to it was gone. The girl screamed and ran to the window, devastated that she'd lost her first gift from Jade. The little girl ran outside and looked around for the balloon, but there was just a crowd of people walking by. Lee walked down the street a little and realized she hadn't kept her promise to hold on to the balloon. A hand reached out from a dark alley, belonging to a woman she didn't recognize. Reaching for the girl, the hand grabbed a lock of her hair, and the stranger asked the girl to come with her so she could tell the fortune of a lady from a wealthy family. Suddenly, the stranger grabbed the girl's arm and started insisting that she needed to know her fate from a young age and be ready to face difficulties at the right time. The woman tried to drag the girl into the alley, promising that a good fortune teller was waiting for her there for 5 silver coins. Lee yanked her hand out of the woman's grip, quickly apologized, and ran away. The girl ran through the crowd of passers-by, further down the street, without looking back. Her heart was pounding from fear and from the exhaustion that had built up while running. After a while, Lee stopped next to an unfamiliar store, trying to catch her breath. Peeking out from behind the corner, the little girl looked around, but didn't see the strange woman. Lee kept going, and suddenly realized she'd run all the way to the toy store on the next street. The little girl looked at the window, but right now she wanted her yellow balloon back more than any new toy. But then it hit her. She had no idea where she was, and she was all alone. The little one decided to walk a bit further down the street to find a familiar place and figure out where she was, since she'd run out of the store without even paying for the dress. Lee walked past a man and started looking around, trying to find the right way, when suddenly the man bumped into her. The girl fell to the ground, and it really hurt. But the man didn't even turn around. He just yelled at her to watch out. Lee got back on her feet and carefully brushed the dust off her dress, so it wouldn't get too dirty. But now she was scared she wouldn't find her way home, and she couldn't think of a new plan. Suddenly, a dark shadow flashed past the girl's face, and Lee noticed it. The shadow disappeared, and Lee thought maybe it was a bird. The next moment, a carriage stopped right next to the girl, its brakes squealing. Standing before the little one was Duke Cullen, chuckling about her already running away from home. But Lee was super happy to see him. The guy admitted he'd heard she'd taken off to the dressing room, and Lee started freaking out because she'd broken his rules. The little one started making excuses real fast, explaining that while Marianne was trying on outfits, she went searching for the balloon Jade gave her. The guy scooped Lee up in his arms to hear more about the balloon, and the girl started rambling again about how she promised not to lose Jade's gift. The Duke calmed her down, saying they could just buy a new balloon, but Lee was more worried about how you can't buy back a promise. Lee remembered the last time the Duke saw her. She was in rags, and she wanted to know how he managed to find her. Cullen smiled at the girl and confessed that she gives off a glow that always draws his eye. The little one got all flustered by the sweet talk and figured all aristocrats must chat like that. After a while, the Duke and Lee arrived at the shop, where the staff were buzzing around near the entrance, searching for the girl. A saleswoman rushed up to the Duke and started fussing, saying the young lady's disappearance scared her half to death, and she almost called the cops. The shop lady apologized, saying one of the customers opened a window to air things out, and she was sorry about the missing balloon. Lady Rosé burst out of the dressing room, laughing that if she'd known the Duke was here, she would have booked a table. It's been ages. The lady stepped closer, eyeing Lee carefully, and asked who this little girl was that the Duke was holding. Cullen kept his cool, politely greeted the lady, and introduced Lee as his daughter. The woman fanned herself and admitted she'd heard rumors that the Duke had taken in a poor orphan. The lady moved closer to Lee again, saying they'd be family soon and should be friends. But Lee didn't buy it, remembering the yelling from the dressing room. Still, the lady gave her a sharp warning look. Then she stepped back, smiled sweetly, and complimented the Duke, saying the girl was prettier than she'd imagined. The Duke said he didn't care what the lady had heard, because his daughter is beautiful. The lady chuckled, saying the Duke's charitable hobbies were admirable, and immediately offered up a strict disciplinarian to consider as a tutor. Suddenly, the lady smacked her fan against her palm and declared that the caretaker was brave and, if necessary, could mete out punishment and also help conceal the girl's origins, The Duke turned away from Rose and set the little girl down on the floor. The man crouched down in front of her and asked who he was to her, but Le blushed and called him Duke. Cullen didn't accept that and demanded she call him her father, and because of his words, the little girl froze in place. Lay was silent, and Cullen realized she was embarrassed by it, but he decided to ask her for a favor. The Duke looked at Rose and asked her to demand that the lady leave the shop herself. The lady shrieked with indignation, but the Duke decided she wasn't getting the hints he was dropping. The man got to his feet and demanded that the lady leave immediately and never appear before him again. Rose dramatically began to faint into the arms of her maids, while Cullen decided to explain it to her in plain language. Just get out of the store. The lady screamed that he didn't dare say such things to her, but Lou looked at Cullen with delight after he showed his true colors. The kid was happy with how the Duke handled the lady, but he still asked her to say goodbye. The Duke leaned in close to Lee and whispered that she'd never see that woman again. The little one clutched the Duke's coat and, looking at the lady, politely said her farewells. Cullen patted Lee on the head, saying that's how you learn aristocratic manners. But the girl was more worried about how the maids had made her look so pretty that morning. The lady stopped faking being sick and started pointing at Lee, threatening her with her high status. Lee tried to smooth her hair, but still decided to tell the lady that her beauty didn't compare to the lady's. Rose didn't get it, but Lee added that if she were as beautiful as the lady, she'd have to get married young. After that, Lee decided to show some backbone and, with a smirk, asked if her looks were good enough to join the circus. Lady Rose dropped the nice act and hissed that only stray cats eavesdrop on other people's conversations. The Duke stepped up to the lady and warned her to leave, because she was the one acting unrefined and like a wildcat who should be careful about making threats against his daughter. Rosé got pissed that he was acting like he owned the place and snapped at her maids, asking what the hell they were doing huddled in the corner. The Duke was heading for the door. Then he turned back to her, hissing that he owned the whole damn street, so she better chill if she ever wanted to get close to him. Colin patted Lay on the head again, promising her that his threats weren't directed at her. The lady decided to turn on the charm, snuggling up to the Duke and begging him to remember the good old days and not be so harsh. Suddenly, the Duke grabbed the lady's arm, and she lit up like a Christmas tree. But the next second, the guy spun her towards the door and confessed that she shouldn't get any ideas just because they had dinner a couple of times. The man pointed her towards the exit, saying she could consider it a breakup right then and there, instead of him breaking her heart. The lady was still blocking the doorway, but the Duke lost it and demanded in a harsh voice that she get the hell out of his store before he called security. His words enraged the girl, and she stormed out of the store, her maid barely keeping up. The Duke immediately turned to Lay, wanting to know about her beef with the lady, but the girl decided to stay quiet to avoid making things worse. Marianne stepped out of the dressing room, surprised to see her brother and the little girl. Cullen noticed his sister was wearing the same outfit she had on 2 weeks ago, even though he was told she was trying on new clothes. But his sister got pissed at him and quickly clapped a hand over his mouth to shut him up from saying inappropriate stuff. Marianne, embarrassed by her brother's insight, explained that dressing rooms are used for all sorts of things. Cullen asked his sister, with her dating hobby, not to cause him any trouble, which made Marianne indignant, saying she could date even if she was a saint. The girl immediately glanced at the store exit, wanting to know if her brother was really dating women like the lady. Cullen exchanged a look with Lay and decided to mess with his sister, saying he'd just gotten dumped. The girl appreciated that she and the Duke now had something in common, and laughed. The man asked how the shopping was going, but Marianne had already packed the purchases into a ton of boxes. The new things made La happy, but she still couldn't believe the insane amount of money being spent on her. My brother and sister started arguing about how much they'd spent, and on what, which made Leah feel better, knowing she wasn't the only one who thought they were overspending. But then Cullen declared they needed to spend twice as much, and Leah was shocked all over again. The Duke promised to make an advance payment for the purchases so the shop could prepare more silk. Leah spoke up, thanking the lady for the clothes and mentioning she already had several dresses at home. But Marianne wasn't satisfied that the girl's entire wardrobe wasn't overflowing. The Duke couldn't help but pat Leah on the head again, saying taking care of her was his duty as her guardian. But the little girl was furious that they were spending a fortune on her. The Duke went further into the store, discussing with his sister what outfits they'd already bought, then asked the saleswomen to bring out more. And Leah was still fuming about their extravagance. Suddenly, Leah came up with a plan. She pretended to feel dizzy and like she was about to pass out. The man stopped and decided that since Leah wasn't feeling well, they should stop shopping, and the girl was thrilled that her plan worked. Later, Leah and the Duke were seeing the lady off to her carriage, and she asked the little girl to spend more time with her. But Cullen declared that she shouldn't hang around with kids. The carriage started moving, but the lady leaned out the window, waving goodbye, promising to see her again and not to worry about the Duke's words. Another carriage pulled up to the store. Leah suddenly remembered her lost balloon when she heard a rustling behind her. An unfamiliar girl with red hair ran out of the alley and reached out to the girl, looking for help. Cullen managed to hide the little girl behind him, but Leah caught a glimpse of the woman's extremely pale face. The stranger couldn't take more than a couple of steps before she collapsed dead on the sidewalk. Cullen knelt beside the woman to take a close look at what had happened to her. Leah suddenly declared that the woman was definitely dead. Then the girl started speculating that there were no visible injuries on the woman's body, and maybe it was just a heart attack. Cullen looked at Leah and didn't deny her guess, only remarking on how observant she was. Sometime later, a squad of police arrived on the scene, and the squad commander began questioning the Duke about what had happened. The commander removed his hat when he realized who he was talking to, but still warned that the interrogation would proceed according to regulations. The guy said the victim was Bennett Allam. No history of health problems, probably a heart attack. The cops covered the body with a sheet, for privacy. The sergeant said she was the daughter of a fishmonger, owns a bunch of stalls down at the market. Lee was all ears to the grown-ups, but she couldn't take her eyes off the body. The sergeant apologized for taking up the Duke's time and gave a bow as the carriage pulled away towards the estate. Back in the carriage, Lee remembered a book saying the capital had the highest crime and weird death rate in the whole empire. Now she wished she'd read the whole thing. The Duke was watching his daughter close. He remembered how brave she was when they first met, but something was spooking her now. Lee flashed back to that weird woman in the alley, reaching out, asking her to come along and find out her destiny. The girl remembered her stroking her hair too. Then she grabbed her hand and started rambling about future dangers and how important it was to know what was coming. Lee looked over at the Duke, tried to chill out, and just shrugged, saying, "Stuff happens, you know?" But the girl's hands were shaking, so she had to grip them tighter and assure the man she was okay. It was late in the evening when the carriage finally arrived at the Levelton family estate. The butler immediately opened the front doors and greeted his lordship with a polite bow. The Duke and Lo walked past Cheyenne, and the guy was stunned when they showed up at the house together, but his lordship just said he picked her up on the way. Jade came down the stairs from the second floor, happy to see his father back. The guy asked why Lei and his father were back together and started worrying that something terrible might have happened, which made Lei flinch. Cullen walked past his son and casually mentioned something had happened, which only made his son even more curious. Jade turned to the little girl when she called his name again. The girl looked down at the floor and confessed that she'd lost her little ball. Jade and Lei sat on the stairs while she told the whole story of how her gift went missing. In the end, Leia was bummed again about not finding her balloon, but Jade just looked at her calmly. The guy patted her head and told her not to worry about something so easily replaced, but she really loved that balloon. Jade stood up and suggested they go horseback riding soon, which surprised her, because he was trying to cheer her up. He reached out his hand to Leah and offered to take her to her room so she could rest before dinner. She looked at his outstretched hand, then rubbed her eyes with her fist like she couldn't believe it. But the next moment, her face lit up like sunshine, and she took Jade's hand. In his study, the Duke put a glass of something on the table and assured Cheyenne he hadn't noticed anything weird about Leah's behavior. Cullen told the butler that whatever's going on, the good thing is Leah's all right. The Duke summoned the dark essence of a serpent into his palm and whispered that they got lucky it turned out okay, only because they managed to summon the shadow. The man took another drink and sighed. "Because raising a kid is tough, man." He slammed the empty glass back on the table with a thud. Dinner was over, and the Duke decided to chill with some music, so he fired up the record player. Leah was mesmerized by the thing, because it was the first time she'd ever seen a gramophone powered by a magic artifact. Then Leah turned to Jade to ask how old he was. She was floored that the kid was only 14. She thought he was older, which made her wonder why he was drinking wine. But he told her they hardly ever touched alcohol or medicine in that house. Leah figured she could try the drink too, but Cullen shut her down, saying she was half Jade's age, so no way. The little one touched her head and got lost in thought for a second. Jade asked what she was up to, but Leah just gave him a sweet smile and promised she'd grow up faster. Cheyenne walked into the living room with a tray in his hands, distracting Cullen from his drink. The butler held out the tray to the Duke, and it was loaded with sealed letters containing classified intel. The Duke tore open the large envelope and began to pore over the report inside. Cullen's eyes scanned the document, and he realized the prince had sent him a real head-scratcher. A woman on the street died of a heart attack, and there were similar cases popping up in the capital. The man opened the second envelope, starting to reason that a second incident could be chalked up to coincidence, but a third one definitely needed police involvement. The information in the envelope stated that 3 women had died in different locations. They came from different social classes, but they all had red hair. Cullen considered the new assignment, then cracked a confident smile, figuring everything would be fine. Lee was thinking that Cullen would soon be going hunting, and even though that was a good thing, she felt a little off, which the Duke noticed. The man pulled off his glove, concerned that the girl didn't look well. Then, he placed his palm on her forehead to check her temperature. Suddenly, La saw a burst of colors in front of her eyes, and her gaze froze. An image from a book flashed in her mind, stating that on August 9th, a new victim of the maniac would be an orphaned girl. The killers lured the girl into a trap, promising she'd learn all about her mother through a fortune-teller's ritual. Sadly, the girl, who only had her mother's name, followed the stranger. The orphan found herself locked in a cage, and to her horror, she was treated differently than the killer's other victims. The perp watched the girl with a saw in his hand, fascinated by her unusual hair color. Her mind started to clear, and Lo began to hear the Leveltons' voices, trying to bring her back to her senses. Finally, she could see them. Cheyenne asked if she remembered today's date. Lei knew it was August 9th, just like in her memory. She gave herself a quick pinch. She remembered that in the book, on this day, a poor orphan named Lo was murdered. In the Levelton family's storybook, there's a chapter called The Fortune Teller's Murder, which starts by saying that from early childhood, the killer lived under his mother's heavy thumb, and his life was like being in a cage. The killer loved his mother as much as he hated her, so at some point, he really messed her up. So, amidst the cognitive dissonance that was seriously messing with his head, he realized his desire. The killer suddenly understood that he himself wanted to be a mother now. His twisted obsession drove him to women who resembled his mother, so he created the persona of a fortune teller selling a miracle beauty product. Women used it, and their appearance transformed, captivating them in the mirror. Temporarily, their cheeks flushed, and their skin improved. But death eventually caught up with them, because the bottle was laced with poison that slowly but surely led to heart failure. Leah stopped trembling, but now she clenched her pajamas in her hand, realizing that if those women's deaths weren't random, the fortune teller she saw on the street was definitely the killer. The girl snuggled closer to the Duke, eager to learn more. The kid tried to clarify. If all the crimes are connected, then the victims must have something else in common. The man pondered, but he didn't quite grasp what the girl was saying. Leah was thinking about the red hair, but she couldn't mention the fortune teller directly, so she vaguely asked if those women had visited a fortune teller, a question that piqued Jade's interest. The girl explained that all fortune tellers come from poor families, but even aristocrats sometimes visit well-known fortune tellers, even in the darkest slums. Leah looked at Cullen and continued to persuade him that rich people usually go to restaurants and boutiques, but a fortune teller's house is a place where people go regardless of their social status. The guy thought about her suggestion and figured it was worth checking out. Leah clutched her head again, feeling a killer pain. Cullen told Cheyenne to get in touch with the Intel Guild, but then he saw the kid curl up on the couch in pain. The guy cradled Leah's head and tried to bring her around, but it was like she couldn't hear him. Her eyes slowly closed, and her mind started to fade again, sinking into darkness. Then she remembered another chapter from the book. But now, the poor orphan with the wounded arm was barely breathing in a cage, while the killer hummed a song and dressed up in a red wig. The orphan's gaze was lifeless. She'd lost an arm, and the pain was so bad, she just wanted the creep to hurry up and finish her off. Cullen snuck into the killer's lair, calmly reading the report about the red hair fetish. Cullen charged at the killer, who was dressed as a woman with red hair, and the killer jumped up. Cullen summoned shadow magic, and a dark rope wrapped around the killer's mouth, silencing him. The assassin tried to fight back, but he soon hit the floor. Cullen approached him. The shadow serpent was still clamped over the guy's mouth as he gasped for his last breaths. The Duke vowed to take care of the killer, tearing him to pieces. His gaze fell on a cage sitting in the dark corner of the room. The floorboards creaked as he got closer, but the girl didn't even notice him. Cullen took her out of the cage. He felt sorry for her, so he decided to get her to a healer, pronto. The man bent down to the little orphan, when suddenly, a metal arrow pierced his chest with unbelievable speed. Staggering, the Duke got back on his feet, but drops of blood were already blooming on his dark cloak. And a moment later, the man collapsed onto the floor in front of the terrified girl. Smirking, the assassin approached, looking at the orphan with anticipation of his reward. Memories faded, and Lee woke up in her bed, her heart pounding like crazy. She bolted upright, gasping for air, and Cullen turned to face her. Everyone stared at Lee, who was still shaking a little, as Cullen gently rubbed her back, checking if she was all right. Lee's face went pale as she realized she wasn't the only one caught up in this mess with the killer. Another sharp memory flashed through her mind. The Duke lying in bed, comatose, after being struck by an arrow. A renowned healer examined the Duke's body and delivered a grim diagnosis. The arrow had been coated with a potent poison. Jade brought in healer after healer to try and save his father, but they were all useless, and Jade sank deeper into despair, lashing out at them in anger. A month passed. The Duke was still unconscious, and the healers were completely stumped. These events sparked a ton of rumors, and Jade had to deal with a mob of people at the estate gates, all demanding the latest news. Some of these people owed the Duke's family a debt, while others were just trying to impress the young master and win him over. But there were dangerous dudes in the crowd too, packing knives and plotting to overthrow the Levelton family. The memories started fading, and the last thing Lil remembered from her past life was dropping a book. And her parents, hearts shattered, trying to comfort each other outside the ER, the last time she blacked out. The memories cut off, and Lei, desperate, started pounding her head, regretting she told the Duke about the fortune teller. Jade grabbed Lou's hands, pulled them away, and asked if she was back with us. Everyone was worried about her. Lei looked around her room and said she was okay now. Cheyenne wiped Lou's face with a damp cloth and told her to speak up about her health, but the girl felt weird with everyone watching her while she was out. The butler told Jade to go to bed, since Lei was all right now. which kinda stung the guy. The little one was floored that Jade was so worried about her and waited for her to wake up. There was a knock at the door, and Cheyenne went to the maid to take the documents from her. The butler said the investigation results you wanted are here, Your Grace, and handed him the envelope. Cullen ripped open the envelope and started reading the report. Leah couldn't help but peek at the documents. The documents had a full report on the victim's activities, and the girl started to worry. What if there's info about the fortune teller? Cullen will head to her place tonight. Leah decided to act and stop the Duke from leaving, so she grabbed his shirt with all her might. The guy looked up from the papers to see what she wanted. Leah didn't have time to come up with an excuse. She was getting anxious, but she didn't want to reveal that she knew about the Duke's life from a book she read in her past life. The girl squeezed her eyes shut, but the Duke calmly asked her to tell him what she wanted. Leah tried to gather her strength and squeezed Cullen's hand again, but all she could manage was to look up at the Duke with a tear-streaked face and beg him in a pitiful voice not to go anywhere. The Duke methodically flipped through the pages of the intelligence agency's report. He dug up a key detail. All the victims were clients of a fortune teller in the slums, a redhead known as the Crimson Witch. Cullen realized Lowe had given him the exact same info, and now this whole thing reeked of a setup. Leia was still holding the Duke's hand while he was going over the documents. After a moment, the girl squeezed his hand, pulling his attention back to her. With a tear-streaked face and a pleading voice, Lowe begged him to stay home. The kid started shaking, a soft rustle as the stack of papers slipped from his grasp, and he was totally lost about what was happening. The papers scattered across the floor as the men tried to calm Leah down, who was now sobbing her heart out. She clung to Cullen's side, wailing that her dreams always came true, so her latest dream where the Duke got hurt was gonna happen too. Lee gripped his shirt in her fists, begging the Duke to just stay with her for one night. The girl wiped her eyes, but the silence made her think she'd pissed him off again. Cullen calmly confessed that the girl's emotions were his top priority right now and agreed to stay at the estate. Leigh worried if the Duke would kick her out because he was mad, but he couldn't figure out why he'd do that to her. Suddenly, the kid had a meltdown, and Jade tried to calm her by stroking her head, but she was beyond stopping. Cheyenne watched the scene in the room with a tight expression and kept his mouth shut. Leigh wouldn't stop sobbing, so the Duke ordered the butler to fetch a sedative from another room. After a while, Jade asked if Lee was all right, but she was super ashamed of how she acted and looked pissed. The door slammed open, and Cheyenne appeared in the room with the medicine on a tray. The guy held out a glass of sedative to the girl, but she refused and promised she'd be fine if the Duke stayed home. Jade also begged her to take the medicine, because Leigh was feeling a little queasy, and to convince her, he and Cheyenne pretended that without it, they'd have to call a doctor and do surgery. The girl grabbed the cup. She remembered her past life in the hospital and didn't want to end up on the operating table again. Lee squeezed her eyes shut, chugging the whole mug in one go, trying to forget everything. A second later, she winced at the bitter taste, but the medicine was already down. The butler wiped her face and praised her, and Jade brought a chocolate candy as a reward. Lee could have done it herself, but then the Duke latched onto her words and slyly asked why she couldn't sleep alone then. The girl slapped the bed with her hands and firmly declared she'd still sleep next to the Duke. Jade started talking to his dad, saying even though Lee doesn't share their blood, they're so alike, even the crying act was well planned. The Duke patted the bed, trying to get Lee's attention, and told her to lie down and get some rest. Lee stood there, all worked up, deciding she wouldn't fall asleep until this night was over. The Duke decided to get his way by being sneaky and hopped under the covers. Lee joined him, but assured the man she'd just lie there next to him, not actually sleep. Jade was totally thrown when the old man invited him to join them. Jade tried to weasel out of it, but Lee's eyes lit up, and she was all sunshine again. After a little grumbling, Jade decided to climb under the covers with them. Cheyenne killed the lights and promised he'd be close by. All they had to do was ring the bell if they needed him. It was the dead of night outside, and Lee's room was plunged into darkness. The girl was lying in the middle, thinking they felt more like a family now than ever before. Thoughts were bugging her. She didn't know where an adopted daughter fit in, but she wanted to dream that they were a family. Lee rubbed her eyes, and Jade told her to crash while she felt sleepy, since that's how the medicine worked. The little one yawned. She already knew she'd been tricked and demanded a promise that the Duke wouldn't leave, even if she fell asleep. Her eyes were closing on their own from exhaustion, so the bedroom ceiling started to blur. Lee covered for them, figuring she'd report the perp to the cops in the morning, then crashed out. A while later, Cullen came down to the hall. Cheyenne helped him get dressed, because the Duke was lost in thought. Cullen noticed Jade was into Lee and was looking out for her. The guy smirked. Now Lee wasn't a mystery to him anymore, seeing how worried she was and ready to protect him. The Duke headed for the door. He wanted to check out the fortune teller's place, see if it was a setup. Cheyenne handed him his cane. The Duke told him if he didn't come back, Lee was definitely a spy sent by his mother's killer. Cullen turned to the butler, hinting that stuff like that needed to stay on the down low. Dawn broke. The Duke stepped outside, already looking forward to a very interesting hunt. It was dead silent in Lee's bedroom. The girl was sleeping like a log in her bed. The sun peeked through the curtains, shining right on her face and waking her up. Groggily getting up, She was ready to head to the cops before the Duke even woke up. But then it hit her. Her bedroom was empty, and the Duke had been gone for a while. Lei climbed out of bed and accidentally stepped on a stack of papers detailing the deceased women. Quickly grabbing the sheets, the girl started studying them, trying to find something important. The next thing you know, she was hurrying over to the couch where Jade was sleeping. She started shaking him hard, and when the guy woke up, he had no clue what was going on. Jade rubbed his eyes wearily and told her that his father had left at dawn to check out some intel. Lei yelled out in anger. She knew the Duke wouldn't listen to her, but she still let herself fall asleep last night. Jumping closer to Jade, Lee asked demandingly if he knew how to ride a horse. Her eyes were full of determination, and she declared that she had a favor to ask, one that had to be done. Jade didn't know what was going on, but he knew how to ride a horse, and before acting, he needed to know what Lo was planning. The girl started begging him to trust her without questions, and she'd make it up to him later. The guy looked intently at Lee, trying to figure out her scheme, but the next second he gave in, and with a drawn-out voice, agreed to help her. Lei didn't wait, grabbed his hand, and dragged him from the bedroom to the stables. The little one was speechless when they arrived at the stable grounds. Standing before her was a magnificent horse, black as night and with a long mane. Jade began fitting the horse with racing gear, while Lei, with excitement and anxiety, examined the animal, because it was several times taller than her. The guy nimbly jumped into the saddle. The horse stood calmly, awaiting a command. Jade extended his hand to Lei, inviting her to join him. The kid was tiny, so she grabbed Jade's hand with both of hers, trying to climb onto the horse. The horse galloped through the capital city's market streets, forcing people to jump out of the way. Lei gripped the horse's mane, holding on for dear life, her face terrified, and she couldn't stop screaming. Jade kept riding down the street, the wind whipping his face, but he couldn't hear what Lo was shouting over the wind as she clung to the horse's mane. Leaning down slightly, Jade checked on Lei, but she wouldn't even open her eyes. But suddenly, Lo found the strength to look around and point to an alleyway. Jade stopped the horse and turned it in that direction. The horse bolted into the deserted alley, where the city's slums were located. Gray clouds gathered over the fortune teller's house, and the place looked totally abandoned. Jade ran after Lei. He recognized the fortune teller's house, but he couldn't figure out why they'd come here looking for her father. The guy slowed down and looked around. He figured her father definitely wasn't here, and Lin needed to calm down. The thud made the kids tense up. Lee was determined and headed for the door to check out the house. Jade grabbed her hand. He had a bad feeling and needed a minute to collect himself. The guy demanded answers from Lee, wanting to know exactly what she knew about this place. The girl reminded him of his promise not to ask unnecessary questions, but just to help her. Jade steadied his breathing and resigned himself to the fact that Lee was using his promise against him. Then, he carefully released the girl's hand from his grip, allowing her to act on her own. Lee listened for the noise behind the closed door, but it immediately stopped. She started worrying about Cullen's well-being. She imagined there could be accomplices in the room with weapons, hiding to avoid capture. Lee turned to Jade and ordered him to run immediately if he saw anyone behind the doors, even though she knew he was stronger than a regular adult. The little girl reached for the doorknob with trembling hands. She suddenly remembered her fantasy, how the killer from the book stood before her, smirking evilly. La froze at the entrance, gripping the doorknob, but inside her head, all her thoughts screamed about how terrified she was to be there. Suddenly, she flung the door open. It slammed against the walls with a crash. She was more worried about Cullen than her own life. The first thing La saw was thick drops of blood, splattered across the floor near the Duke's feet. Next to him, the killer's legs dangled in the air, shrouded in a dark mist. The killer was dressed in a fortune teller's outfit, still sporting red hair, but his neck was caught in a dark noose, making him cough up blood. The Duke stood facing the killer, using dark magic to pull him up to the ceiling. The man tightened the noose even more, forcing the criminal's body higher towards the roof, so he desperately tried to escape the trap with his last bit of strength. Lei couldn't contain her gasp, forcing the Duke to turn his attention to her and loosen his grip on the rope. Jade was shocked that the killer actually disguised himself as someone else. Callan gripped the magic rope tighter as the assassin tried to break free, then ordered Jade to grab Lee and get out of the house. The guy hugged Lee and tried to cover her eyes so she wouldn't see anything awful, but the girl started fighting him. Lei was freaking out, watching in horror through Jade's fingers, not understanding who would fire the arrow at the Duke if everyone was gone. Her gaze fell on the assassin's hand when it twitched as the criminal made another attempt to escape the trap. Jade almost got the girl outside when she suddenly realized what the arrow trap was all about. La broke free from Jade's grasp and ran back to the Duke to warn him. The loud thud of her feet echoed through the room as she tried to shout to the Duke, who was completely focused on the assassin. The girl ran up to him and grabbed his arm, forcing the man to lose his concentration. In the next instant, an arrow meant for someone else pierced Lo's back, and the Duke, startled, let the criminal escape his trap. The assassin watched as his secret arrow trap went off, and a smile crept across his face. La fell into Cullen's arms as a totally freaked-out Jade hurried down the stairs. Cullen caught the little one, trying to bring her around. The girl squeezed her eyes shut, a jolt of pain shooting through her. Jade practically sprinted to his father as he tried to get Le to focus and stay awake. The Duke begged Le to look at him, but she was already spent, her shoulder burning like crazy. Jade leaned over Lee, promising her everything would be all right, but his face was etched with terror. Suddenly, Le remembered her past life again. How her parents looked at her exactly the same way, promising everything would be okay. The memory shifted. Now she was being wheeled into surgery, her body almost giving out. And the last thing she tried to do was reach out to her parents. Lo's mind was racing, but she managed to extend her hand, touch Cullen's face, and call him Daddy in a small voice. Lei was totally out of it, so all she could manage was to apologize for everything. The Duke was stunned, but when Leah's hand slipped from his cheek, it hit him. His heart was shattered. Jade was freaking out, begging Leah to wake up. He started shaking her, but she was out cold. Even though they needed to act fast, Cullen just sat there, frozen, holding Leah close. Cheyenne showed up at the fortune teller's place, cool as a cucumber, but he announced that the young master and mistress were missing. But then the butler nearly had a heart attack when he saw the Levelton family and a wounded Leah on the floor. The Duke pulled Leah close again, but he was paralyzed, lost in memories of the past. Cullen flashed back to his father's face, the way he accused him of being a curse on the Levelton line. Cullen's father was jealous of his son's magical abilities, always biased against him, so glancing back, he realized with disgust that he'd made a deal with a devil he didn't even summon. But deep down, the head of the family feared his son, so he never hesitated to flex his power and keep him in line with punishments. Cullen's mother loved him dearly, so whenever he buckled under his father's pressure, she always pulled him close and shielded him from the blows. Hugging her son, she always promised she'd be there for him, and that Cullen should never doubt her love. But even her love couldn't save him, so she started taking all the blows from the head of the family herself. When the time came, and the Duke's mother passed, young Cullen realized with a broken heart that his world had shattered. The Duke's mind snapped back from a distant memory, because he realized that, just like then, his world was crumbling again as little Leah lost consciousness in his arms. The man looked at the little girl. He knew he'd only adopted the beggar girl on a whim, but what bothered him was that he didn't know why she'd saved his life from that arrow. The man leaned closer to Leah's face, wondering why she hadn't hated him, since she'd seen him do certain things. Cheyenne yelled and knelt beside the Duke, snapping Cullen back to reality so he could look around. Jade and Cheyenne didn't hide their fear, waiting for the Duke to do something. The Duke turned to the butler, because a plan was starting to form in his mind. The guy nodded toward the perp and ordered Cheyenne to take him down to the dungeon. The butler jumped to it, glaring at the killer. He was ready to do anything his master asked. Cullen handed Lee over to Jade, telling him to stop the bleeding from her shoulder and find something she could bite down on without hurting her tongue. Jade ripped a sleeve off his shirt with his teeth to make a tourniquet. Cullen summoned a magical shadow with healing powers. Lee flinched, clamping down on the tourniquet as the magic washed over her. The girl whined, stretched out by the shadow's power. The magic shadow faded. Lei was breathing a lot easier now, but her eyes were still closed. The Duke checked her over, and when he didn't see any more bleeding, he calmed down. The man looked around for the butler to help carry the little one to safety. Cheyenne was trying to tie up the killer with rope when Cullen yelled that he was heading to the family's hotel. The kid was brought to the hotel room. Cullen and Jade were on edge, waiting for the healer to check her out. The Duke stood facing the bed and demanded an explanation of his child's condition. The healer packed up his tools and admitted that, for now, the girl's condition was stable. But without a surgeon, he couldn't fully assess the danger. The healer was relieved the arrow wasn't poisoned and had missed the heart, but the Duke was unmoved and approached the bed. Cullen stared at Lee's pale face and threatened to wipe out every healer in the city if she died. Terrified, the doctor bowed quickly to the Duke and promised to do everything possible to help Lee recover. The Duke carefully sat on the bed, trying not to disturb the girl's body. He was lost in thought, overwhelmed by the emotions he'd experienced, allowing long-forgotten memories to resurface. For a long time, the man had believed Lee was either a target with a red flower or a spy ready to kill him. Cullen smirked, realizing he'd gained valuable intel the previous night, and everything about the girl was just a coincidence. But the thought of her calling him Papa just wouldn't leave his mind. He gently touched the girl's cheek, still not believing she'd shielded him from that arrow with her own body. He brushed her hair back, deciding he wanted to take care of her, even if Lo was setting him up. Now, Cullen was also worried about the parental bond that had formed. Like Lee, he was now deeply responsible. The Duke took the little girl's hand and vowed that even if she was protecting an enemy, he'd take her and make her his own daughter. He squeezed Le's hand, resolving that when she woke up, he'd raise her so well that even if he was struck down, she'd just haughtily walk right on by. Cullen kissed the girl's hand, deciding it would be best to keep her in this hotel room so she could wake up sooner. But days passed, and doctors had turned the hotel room into a makeshift hospital ward with curtains around the bed. Cullen watched the group of healers gathered at the door, not interfering as they discussed her treatment plan. But his face showed how much he was suffering through the agonizing wait for news. The Duke settled onto the living room couch. Cheyenne anxiously inquired about the young lady's health. The doctors said she was out of danger, but Jade had shut down emotionally after the incident. Cheyenne brought the Duke a drink and explained that his son had been waiting for the medical procedure to finish, so he's gone to get some rest now. The butler poured a drink into a glass, noting that the young master was in a fragile state right now. The Duke took the glass, wanting to know how soon the priests from the temple would arrive to start healing the girl with their magic. Cheyenne explained that the kingdom was celebrating a temple festival, so the high-ranking priests were there, but they would come to the estate as soon as it was over. Cullen took a sip and said in a frigid tone for Cheyenne to pass on his warning to the king. The man slammed the glass down, promising that if the king didn't send the priests right now, he would personally show up at the royal court. The Duke paused for a second. Then his eyes flashed crimson, and he added that any royal child he encountered in the palace would face a reckoning for what happened to his daughter. Leah lay peacefully in bed, having been unconscious for a long time now. Jade was in agonizing suspense, looking exhausted from spending so much time waiting by Leah's bedside. The guy remembered coming to the empty library at his family's estate. That day, a weird fluffy critter flew through the room, and he spotted it. Jade was just a kid, but the little thing sparked his curiosity. The creature, kinda like a kitten, but with little wings on its back, was looking at him expectantly. The boy picked up the animal and carefully checked out the strange kitten. His father showed up in the library and told him the creature in Jade's hands was a chimera. A chimera was a creature that shares its whole life with one master, a creature that feels the same things its partner does. The chimera curiously sniffed the boy's face as his father informed Jade that he was now in charge of taking care of the new pet. The animal was cute, and Jade remembered the words about how the chimera was now his other self, something he needed to take care of as well as himself. Jade moved closer to Lay's bed, studying her face and thinking how much she looked like Popo right now. The guy gently stroked the girl's cheek. He missed her, but she was still different from his chimera. He remembered the day he gave her a balloon. Right now, he really missed her smile, but the happy memory faded, replaced by another. Seeing her pierced by that arrow again, a decision that left Jade with so many doubts. With each new thought, he grew sadder. He couldn't understand why he hadn't trusted her, and how she'd dared to protect his father. Overwhelmed by emotions, the guy felt a strange heaviness in his chest. Jade dropped his head onto the bed, his feelings so intense that he gripped the sheet tightly, trying to ease his longing for Lou. Moans and sobs echoed through the room, coming from one of the healers, begging to be allowed to see his family. Lo cracked open one eye. Strangers still surrounded her, discussing their options for getting back home. The little one looked around. Her bed was enclosed by white curtains, keeping the sunlight from bothering her. She slowly tried to piece together the events of the past, how she'd saved Cullen from the arrow. Lee tried to say something, but after being silent for so long, her voice was hoarse and muffled. Suddenly, she panicked, thinking she'd died again, and yanked the blanket, tears already streaming down her face. But she calmed down immediately when she saw a dark-haired head next to her. Jade was sleeping right next to her face, his head buried in his elbow. The girl jumped up in bed, slowly crawled towards the guy, and was just so relieved to be alive. Jade was sound asleep. Lee sat across from him, careful not to wake him, wondering what he was doing by her bed. The guy stirred a little and cracked open his eyes, trying to figure out who was moving around near him. In a flash, the guy woke up, propped himself up on his hand, and said in the most charming voice that he'd really missed his princess. His actions threw Lee for a loop, so she just stared at him, speechless. Then, her face relaxed. She calmed down, and gave the guy the most adorable smile she could muster. Lee was waving her arms around, yelling happily that she'd made it through and nobody had died from the poison arrow, damn it! Jade was watching her flail, but couldn't understand a single word, because all that was coming out of her throat were raspy noises. The guy looked at her with relief, but his eyes still held a ton of sadness, which made Lee chill out a bit. Jade poured a glass of water. His being so distant struck Lee as super weird. He held out the water. Lee grabbed it, but Jade told her to take it easy. The water made Lee feel even better, and she was almost ready to get back to normal. The guy took the glass away, trying to stay calm. But Lee had a bunch of questions, and from what Jade was saying, she realized they were in a hospital. Jade scooted closer. He told her the Duke was doing okay, even though Lee had been out cold for a whole week. Lee's joy turned into worried surprise. She didn't get why so much time had passed. Suddenly, Jade jumped up, yanked open the curtains, and yelled about Lee being back. The kid peeked out from behind the guy, all curious about the visitors in her room. A bunch of healers were standing around the bed, trying to calm down the head doc, but now their faces were pale and worried as they looked at the kids. After that, they started hugging each other, stoked that they'd all see their families soon and get back to their lives. The head doc asked Jade how he ended up in the room, but he just brushed off the question, cold as ice. The whole thing seemed weird to Lee, so she asked Jade about all the strangers in the room. Jade explained that all these doctors, who originally promised to heal quick, worked on her shoulder and figured out there wasn't any poison on the arrow. But the doctors screwed up. There was a potion on the arrow they missed, so the Duke threatened to make them heal you or they'd lose everything. Because of their screw-up, Lee's life was in danger. Jade tried to visit her, but every visit was filled with worry for the girl's life. Le got goosebumps hearing the guy's story. She was horrified thinking about what could have happened to her and how lucky she was. Jade glared at her. He didn't share the joy about being lucky, because she was in serious danger from that arrow hitting her. The girl tried to make light of it, joking that since the potion wasn't a total game changer, they might as well leave it to fate and stay positive. Her words eased the guy up a bit, and he admitted it all felt like some kind of miracle. Le pointed at the doctors, still not quite getting why they were so happy about, staying alive. A bunch of grown-up healers were hugging and crying, while Jade reminded Lu that their dad could be a real piece of work. Jade remembered Cheyenne, who was with their dad that awful day, and even the butler looked terrified by the Duke's behavior. Cheyenne tried to calm the Duke down, but he was furious that someone had sacrificed themselves to save him, and he was so worked up, Cullen was pacing the room, saying he'd make someone pay if Lu didn't get better. Lei was really touched by the story. She was moved that the Duke had been so worried about her all that time. While explaining how ticked off the Duke was, Jade started rummaging under Lu's bed. Apparently, the Duke was ready to pick names out of a hat to punish the doctors if they didn't get Lei to wake up. The guy pulled out a box, and the little one started digging through it for a slip of paper, while Jade finished the story about how Cullen would have punished one of the doctors at random to motivate the others. Lei pulled out a slip of paper, picturing it as some kind of penalty game for the doctors, and she was intrigued. The girl unfolded the slip, but it had a huge skull drawn on it, meaning death as punishment for whoever drew it. Jade laughed that Lei had hit the jackpot, but his fun was far from the girl's mood, who was horrified. Lei clenched the slip in her hands. She was furious that such a punishment could even be conceived, because doctors aren't some kind of sinners. Jade smiled softly. He agreed that all the doctors were the best in the entire capital, invited as soon as something bad happened to Lei. Lei wondered how the royal family allowed this, but the guy confessed that the family actually helped organize all the treatment. The girl imagined the Duke on the throne, cared for by the royal family, and her fantasies said that the Duke's family was more important than the king. A quiet rustle echoed in the room, drawing the children's attention. The best doctors of the capital lined up, requesting to conduct a medical examination for the young lady. The head doctor, under Jade's supervision, examined her and asked the girl not to overexert her injured shoulder, promising to check in later. Jade jumped up to the man, demandingly asking if he was sure of the diagnosis, causing the doctor to sweat and, with a trembling voice, promised the young lady's full recovery. The other doctors started bowing low to the young lady, thrilled that she was the luckiest girl in the whole kingdom. The doctors were waiting near the exit, hoping to ask to be dismissed, but they froze, paralyzed with fear. Jade nodded, letting them go, but warned them that he personally oversaw the selection process, and they were all fortunate today. The healers started crying again, and enthusiastically thanked the young master for his mercy. The crowd started rushing out the door, but Jade yelled after them that only her father could authorize their departure. Suddenly, Lei lunged at the guy, grabbing his jacket, demanding he not hide the truth about what happened during her illness. The guy sat the girl back down on the bed and prepared to tell his story. From what the adults told him, Jade understood that the fortune teller's house was rigged with traps, but only one was triggered. The trap, a loaded crossbow, was activated by a ring that the fortune teller had to turn the right way. Turning it right would fire an arrow with deadly poison. Turning it left, an arrow with a potion. When the Duke caught the criminal in a noose and started hoisting him up to the ceiling, the trap mechanism was triggered. But the perp couldn't twist the ring the right way, so, lucky for her, Lei's still kicking because the arrow that hit her was loaded with a potion. Hearing all that just zapped the joy right out of Lei, because the danger she was in was way too close for comfort. The little one started thinking about that book, where the Duke gets nailed by a poisoned arrow, same as her. The kids hung out while Jade laid out all the facts for Le about the killer's motives. Dude was so obsessed with his mom, he started offing women who looked like her. Lu's piecing together the book and what Jade's telling her, when suddenly the guy gets pissed and admits he's bummed the killer bit the dust so fast. Lei was shook, totally freaked out, cause she doesn't know what other messed up stuff killers in this world are capable of. Jade swore up and down that his dad made the killer pay big time, so she's got nothing to sweat now. The guy gave her shoulder a squeeze, worried that Le might still be hurting from the wound. Jade started rambling about how gnarly the wound was, super deep, and how Le could have croaked any second. He sounded all worked up, and Lo pictured herself like a toy with a limb torn off. She suddenly yanked her hand away from Jade, then got scared she might never heal up right and be stuck with a bum arm forever. The guy promised that after a whole bunch of priests healed her up from the injury, she wouldn't feel any pain and everything would be cool. Lei didn't want to know how much trouble she caused her family, that they even had to pull the most valuable priests from the temple to heal her. But Jade just asked her to take a donation to the temple that Marianne would appreciate. Jade kept patting Lei on the head. He had missed her a lot during that time. But the fun didn't last. The girl didn't get answers to all her questions. So from the lack of information, she squeezed her dress tightly to prepare to question Jade. The guy touched Lei's hair again and demanded an answer to why she did something so reckless. The guy knew that if the arrow hit the father, he would still be alive. but Lee made up that the arrow would still be dangerous if it hit the heart. Lee was glad that everything was okay now, and her bravery made Jade incredibly proud of the girl. His words embarrassed the little one, and she tried to excuse herself, saying that she didn't want to see Cheyenne and Jade sad if something bad happened to the Duke. The guy realized that she had just lied to him, but for the sake of her smile, he didn't demand another truth. Jade bowed his head and apologized to Lee, because he didn't believe her from the very beginning, and they ended up in danger. It suddenly hit Lo. In her rush, she hadn't even come up with an excuse for running to that fortune-teller's place. Her face went white. She couldn't tell the guy she'd learned everything from some book, in another life. Jade tried to ask Lo some questions, but she started bouncing on the bed and demanding food, saying she'd used up so much energy being unconscious. A while later, the girl was sitting contentedly on the bed, having just finished a big meal. But her peace was shattered when Jade said he could send a messenger for the Duke and call him to the hospital. Lee grabbed the guy's jacket again, frantically yelling not to do that, and not to distract the Duke from important business, since she still hadn't come up with an excuse for what she'd done. A dark cloud hung over Lo. She almost believed the Duke would deal with her harshly, because she knew too much about his secret life as a, specialized professional. Jade didn't understand her, or why she didn't want to see her father. Lo started distracting Jade by saying she cared about the Duke's business, but if he came himself, she'd be happy to see him. Jade suspected she was lying, and asked directly if Lee believed her father had visited her every day. The guy saw the doubt on the girl's face, so he decided to pinch her cheeks, and promised that her father had only stepped away for a bit, but he was always close by. The girl's mind was racing. She wanted to believe that since Cullen came every day, he wasn't quite as furious with her anymore. Jade went to the door, and promised they'd talk about everything when her father got back. The door slammed shut, and Lei was left alone in the huge hospital room. Now she didn't have much time to come up with an excuse, but as a backup, she decided to pretend she didn't remember anything. But she knew the Duke's sharp mind, and such an obvious lie definitely wouldn't save her. So clutching her head, Lo started to think. The Duke and Cheyenne were searching the alley where the fortune-teller's house was when they stumbled upon new clues. In the house where the killer planned his murders, there were huge piles of the red flowers that Lo had brought once. Cullen was pissed that the police had allowed the crime scene to be compromised. He examined the flowers closer, then noticed they'd been there for a while. Suddenly, Cullen's gaze snagged on something among the pile of petals. The man's face darkened, and he told Cheyenne to get the police to the house. Amongst the sheer number of flowers, a hand peeked out. The Duke realized there was a body hidden beneath all those plants. The police put a guard on the fortune-teller's place, but a crowd of neighbors still gathered. The police searched the room and found the body of a guy hidden under the petals, a flower seller from the alley. The police captain gave the Duke a report. The flower seller helped the fortune-teller get customers by talking about some miracle cure. Cullen started making new plans. Now he knew the perp had an accomplice. The guy was thinking hard. He'd heard a story about a flower seller in that alley before. The captain said they didn't know who sent the flowers, because there were so many, way more than needed to hide the body. Cullen grabbed the captain. It hit him. The police witnesses were kids living in the alley, orphans who hung out with Lei. But the captain's answer floored the Duke. He said the kids often shared the leftover flowers with each other. Cullen bolted for the door. He realized the flowers Legat weren't just a coincidence. The guy was booking it to the carriage, heading to the hospital to see the girl. He knew the boy's death wasn't just some accident. Cullen hopped into the carriage, barking at the butler to come with him. The man was terrified. All he could think about was making sure the little girl was safe. Lee's thoughts were a tangled mess, mostly about how the Duke felt about her now. Footsteps pounded down the hallway as Cullen sprinted towards Lee's room. The door crashed open, sending the little girl jumping in fright in her bed. Lee managed to duck behind the headboard before the people rushed in. Cullen and Cheyenne burst into the room, totally winded, looking around like crazy. Finding nothing, the men leaned against the wall to catch their breath, still trying to recover. The Duke strode purposefully towards Lee, who was frozen in fear, now absolutely convinced he was about to get rid of her. The Duke's hand almost touched her face. Leah squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for anything, but Cullen grabbed her shoulders tight and hugged her, kneeling down as he held her close. Leah didn't know how to react, but when the Duke said he was her dad, and he was there for her now, her heart stopped. The man let go of Leah and started apologizing for not being around because of urgent business, but now he'd spend time with her because he was so worried about her. His words got to Leah. Overwhelmed, she gripped the hem of her pajamas. Before, when she was sick, nobody cared for her. She remembered suffering alone, when times were tough and hunger was everywhere. Even though she had friends, she could only rely on herself. Leah looked at the Duke, her heart fluttered, and she finally understood what it was like to have others care. But she immediately shook those good thoughts out of her head, because now the Duke could make any decision he wanted about her life in the family. Resigned, Leah started to talk about her late-night escape, but Cullen cut her off. The man rummaged in his pocket, making Leah watch what he was doing. Holding out his palm with the red flower on it, he asked if she'd seen plants like this anywhere else. The girl touched the flower and reminded him that she'd given him that plant. and she didn't know anything else about it. Cullen believed her and took the cursed flower from her hands. The Duke calmed down, but Lee still saw a shadow of doubt on his face, even though he was silent. Cullen reached out to her and thanked her for saving him, but he was ashamed that, as a father, he should be taking care of his daughter, not the other way around. He stroked Lee's hair, firmly telling her that she shouldn't do that again, not for him, not for anyone. The girl tried to argue, but eventually agreed with the Duke, while Cheyenne, watching the reunion, stood happily to the side. Cullen had missed the little one and kept stroking her hair, and Lee was enjoying the attention. The girl relaxed so much that Cullen got worried about her health, started checking her over, and threatened that the doctors were quacks who'd be punished if they hadn't healed her. From the Duke's angry words, in the next room, one of the doctors felt a chill run down his spine. Cullen didn't get why his daughter wasn't grilling him about everything she saw at the fortune teller's place, but just knew the Duke had taken care of a real piece of work. The girl knew Cullen didn't touch anyone who hadn't committed a truly unforgivable act. That was his golden rule. So when she didn't ask questions, the room went silent. Her simplicity surprised him. She wasn't so scared of him that she'd run away screaming. Cullen decided to do a little probing. He needed to know why Lo had insisted Jade go to the fortune teller's house in the dead of night. Lo stayed quiet. The Duke hinted he was just curious, and then Lo confessed she'd seen report pages on the bedroom floor. Because that night, when the Duke promised to stay with her, he really did forget a report in her room, a report containing vital intel on a killer. The man considered that he had forgotten the reports that evening. This behavior alarmed Lee, because Cullen was always meticulous about everything he did. Cheyenne was standing off to the side, but couldn't help but ask Le if she could actually read. Lee admitted that when she lived on the streets, she memorized what all the signs looked like, so she knew the fortune teller's house because there were rumors in the alleys that the grim predictor was taking children. But that evening, Le noticed similar writing on the documents that was also on the sign and in the report, so she figured the fortune teller's house was the scene of the crime. These clues helped Leah figure out where to look, so that night she woke up Jade and they went to rescue Cullen. The Duke found it hard to believe her, even though she sounded truthful, but the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like some kind of miracle. Cullen nervously tapped his fingers on his leg, figuring his daughter showed off her skills, made conclusions, and even used his report. The man tried to stay calm, even though he had way more questions now than before. But he decided to end the interrogation and asked Leah not to pull stunts like that again. Cullen promised he'd always listen to the girl from now on, because she's not just smart, but also pretty perceptive for her age. Leah didn't expect the man to come to those conclusions about her, but still decided not to mention her memories about the book. She looked at the red flower again. It raised a lot of questions for her, because it made the Duke anxious again, just like on her first day at the estate. Leah decided to find out why this flower caused the Duke so much inner turmoil. The butler was surprised that the girl was asking such insightful questions. His stare made Lee look away, regretting how curious she'd been. The Duke decided to be honest. He admitted the red flowers were left by a real piece of work. But even with all these clues, the guy still doesn't know who this creep is, so Lee was freaked out by what he said. Cullen explained that at every crime scene, the red flowers were delivered specifically to give a hint, one he can't figure out how to use. And even with all these leads, the killer keeps running wild in the capital, knowing the Duke has no idea who he is. These details totally shocked the kid, and her heart started pounding like crazy from the fear. But she realized her adoption was now up in the air, because Cullen was hoping to crack the puzzle, and now the Duke's sincerity in caring for her was questionable. The kid was ready to burst into tears. She didn't know what to do, because she'd gotten really attached to the Duke and Jade. There wasn't a single chapter about this in the book, so the girl had no clue what to do now. The man noticed the change in her behavior. He admitted that she was very clever for her young age. Cullen stroked Lee's cheek, remembering how he'd once suspected her of being a spy. But after everything she'd gone through for the Levelton family, he felt differently about her now. Lee couldn't buy his sincerity that quickly, but the man insisted she was his savior now, even if she was still a suspicious little kid. But the man was happy they had such an amazing father-daughter relationship, a confession that caught Lee off guard. Cullen promised that everything would be okay for them now. The Duke knelt beside the girl and explained that his job was to deal with the real bad guys, the ones the cops couldn't touch. Lee listened intently, even though the information he was sharing was top secret. Cullen implied that only the Levelton family should know about his business. But since Lee was family too, he could let her in on it. The way Lee calmly accepted such dangerous information surprised the man. He couldn't figure out why she was so unfazed. Lee declared she'd take those family secrets to her grave, and nobody would ever pry that information out of her. The man sighed. These conversations were draining him, but he still wanted to know so much more. The girl tensed up, because at this point, you could expect anything from the Duke. All Cullen cared about was why she was calling him Duke again. He leaned in close and asked her to call him by the right name again. Lee felt awkward. Cullen was staring her down, waiting for an answer, but every word grated on him. He reminded her she'd called him the right thing before, so after a moment's thought, the girl called him Daddy. Lee's face went red with embarrassment, when Cullen demanded she always call him that. The Duke asked for Jade to be brought in. He'd crashed in the next room after staying up for ages watching over Lee. The man scooped the little girl into his arms, ready to head back to the estate. Lee wrapped her arms around his neck, so happy that all the bad stuff was over. The Duke's carriage was decked out with balloons, so Lee's happiness went through the roof, and she couldn't help but squeal. Jade threw Lee a party, showering her with a ton of balloons, which she absolutely loves. The Duke watched intently as Lo's happiness grew with each passing moment. Suddenly, the man asked if they should stop at a toy store, but his words made the girl uneasy. Cullen mentioned that last time, Lei was really eyeing the toy store window, looking super adorable. It felt like ages ago to Lei, because if it wasn't for the lost balloon, she wouldn't have found that store. She remembered that whenever there were festivals, parents would often take their kids to those kinds of shops. She always watched from around the corner, because the world she lived in and the world of those kids were completely different. She imagined what it would be like if she and the Duke could go to that store, just like other parents did. The man promised that they could go to the store anytime, because he just bought the whole place. A loud gasp came from inside the carriage, because Le definitely wasn't expecting that kind of statement from the Duke. Looking at the guys, she asked Cheyenne to convince her the Duke wouldn't do something like that, but the butler sadly admitted he couldn't stop Cullen. Cheyenne let slip that the Duke was so stressed about picking out the perfect welcome home gift for her, he totally lost it. She felt awkward that he bought out a whole store, but the guy turned to the window, kinda sheepishly admitting he'd only put a down payment on the store. Cullen waved it off, saying he only had one experience buying gifts for little kids, and he only gave Jade a gift because Marianne talked him into it. Back then, the guy picked out a teddy bear dressed up in a soldier's uniform. But when Cullen gave him the gift, little Jade declared he just wanted a rational father-son relationship, so regular gifts didn't impress him. Jade jumped in, asking that from now on, they give each other peace of mind for birthdays instead of awkward moments like this, since Cheyenne always buys the gifts anyway. The butler was annoyed he'd been exposed, but Jade had known for ages that his dad would never give tasteless gifts like toys or books. Father and son started arguing, since Cullen let his son get away with a lot of weird stuff, even giving him a snake. Lei watched them, feeling sad that her family's relationships were so cold, since Jade still hadn't gotten a birthday gift directly from the Duke. Cheyenne whispered that the Duke's just not experienced enough when it comes to picking out gifts and other thoughtful gestures. Cullen kept grumbling that his taxidermied animal gifts were just like any plush toy from the store. Leah watched her dad, already figuring out that he wasn't a very spoiled kid and didn't get gifts from his family. The little one tugged at the man's jacket and promised that if he had nightmares, the teddy bear could always chase away the bad thoughts. Leah giggled and declared sternly that with habits like that, they needed to make some new rules. The girl proudly tossed her head and demanded that from now on, they come to her room when they're scared and hug her until the Duke gets his teddy bear. But her words sounded ridiculous, so everyone in the carriage turned to look at her. The Duke couldn't help himself and started stroking Leah's hair again. Cullen looked at her and assured her that because of his strong feelings for her, he could just eat her up. But the girl didn't appreciate his offer. Cheyenne clarified what exactly the young lady wanted from the toy store, while she was recovering her health sitting in the manor. Leah asked to give the store back to its owners, but Cullen promised he'd give the store to her when she grew up. The little one asked the Duke to get her just one doll, picked out by him, instead of buying the whole damn store. The guy paused, asked her to repeat herself. She said she'd be happy with any doll he chose, but her words just made him smirk. He hated that she kept calling him Duke, but he kissed her forehead anyway and promised to get her any doll she wanted. Lei patted her head and smiled. The carriage was almost at the manor gates when Lo demanded the toy store give the Duke back the whole deposit. It was late, and Lei was bored out of her skull, sprawled on the bed in her room. After they got back to the manor, Cheyenne told her to stay in bed until the healers and priests arrived. Lo sat up. She wasn't in pain anymore thanks to the priest's magic, but she was still freaked out about almost kicking the bucket. She decided to take a little walk, because she was already sick of sitting around. She slowly dashed towards the open balcony door. She barely took a few steps before collapsing on the floor, gasping for air. Her body was still a wreck. Moonlight streamed in through the window, and Lee, noticing it, was captivated by the moon's beauty. Lee sat bathed in the light, remembering it was the moon festival, when the moon is at its absolute fullest. She was worried that now, without knowing what happens next in the book, she'd be totally useless. Lee couldn't shake the fact that even Cullen himself understood how dangerous the killer with the red flowers was. The book described how successfully Cullen handled the incident, but now Lee had a bad feeling about the flower guy. But in the chapter about the red-haired fortune teller, there was one detail that stood out. The perp used a special poison, odorless and tasteless, but no average Joe could get their hands on that stuff. Lee took her time getting up, trying to piece together the facts into new leads. Opening the window, she wondered if Cullen had the same thoughts she did. She remembered his request to call him Dad. Leah had long stopped thinking about family, but sometimes she dreamed of having someone she could call that. But living alone on the streets, she often pushed those thoughts out of her head. However, now she had people who had managed to pull her out of her loneliness. She had Jade, Cheyenne, and Dad by her side, but with so many good things happening, she was afraid something bad would come along. Leah wondered that when she started calling the Duke Dad, she'd be reaching out her hand to him, but there might come a time when he no longer needed her. The little one shook her head, trying to get rid of the bad thoughts. Bowing her head in prayer, the little one decided to ask the moon for a little help. Leah whispered, asking the moon to help her stay in this house for a long time. At another estate, an aristocrat stood on the balcony watching the moon, when one of his servants reported that he had dealt with the flower merchant and deliberately left the guy's body in plain sight. The aristocrat smirked, deciding they needed to be more careful about the criminals they chose to help with their endeavors. The servant watched his master, who hinted that, under the moonlight, everyone's on a level playing field. The master sat down and promised to help anyone needing his guidance, seeing as he's a pro at planning things. The aristocrat was curious about the adopted daughter in the Cullen family, and the servant presented his report. The man mused that the girl was too young for flowers just yet, but he'd already set things in motion. The aristocrat chuckled, now wondering what role the girl would play in the Duke's family. In the moonlight, a flower tattoo flashed on the man's hand. He was now waiting to meet Le. Morning came, and Le stirred sleepily in bed until her face bumped into something soft. The girl cracked open her eyes, trying to figure out what was next to her. Bolting upright in bed, she excitedly held up a plush teddy bear. Completely losing it, the little one started hugging the toy, thrilled by how soft it was. While Leia was checking out the bear's multicolored eyes, a black envelope dropped right next to her. Picking up the letter, Leia was surprised by the find and figured the Duke had sent it. She decided Cheyenne could help her decipher the important message. The butler was chatting with the staff when suddenly, rapid footsteps echoed down the hallway. The adults turned towards the shout that could be heard all over the house. Lee raced towards the butler, waving the black envelope as she ran. The girl showed Cheyenne the bear, but the man was more worried that all that running might aggravate her wound. The girl twirled the bear around. Cheyenne smiled at her and suggested it might be a gift from the Duke, since a toy like that would take a long time to make. Lei held out the envelope to the man and asked him to read everything that was written inside. The butler opened the letter, his face dropping as he realized what it said. The guy confirmed that Cullen did give away that stuffed animal he kept in his office forever. Cheyenne gave the envelope back to Leah and told her to go to the Duke and ask him to read the card himself. The guy said the letter mentioned Leah's new name, so he insisted she go to the Duke and get the info firsthand. Leah started freaking out about how long noble names are and how she didn't want to lose part of herself because of it. Then, behind the butler, there was a faint rustling sound. The Duke asked Cheyenne to read the letter, scaring everyone in the hallway with his ninja-like appearance. Cullen was loving the whole situation and told the butler to hurry up and read the damn letter. Cheyenne was super uncomfortable, but he took the envelope and card again. The guy started reading the text off the paper in a monotone, saying that Leah should come up with a new name for the toy. The Duke laughed and told Cheyenne to put a little more oomph into his reading. The butler grabbed the toy, waving it around, and cheerfully announced that the teddy bear wasn't the only one getting a new name. From now on, Lee's name was Letitia, which means a sky covered in 1,000 moons. Lee petted the teddy bear, while Cheyenne finished reading the letter, which promised that the bear would protect her from any nightmares, and its gemstone eyes would always light her way. The little girl squeezed the toy. Before, her name just meant born on Monday, but the Duke kept part of her old name in the new one, so she can still carry some memories of her past life and her mother. Cullen looked at his daughter and was overjoyed that, among the thousands of kids born on Monday, he got the one comparable to 1,000 moons in the sky. The little one was shy, but she thanked Cheyenne for reading the letter. Cullen decided to tease Cheyenne and also praised him for the reading, even though the butler was embarrassed by his little performance. The Duke knelt next to Lei, worried about whether she liked her new name. He confessed that he'd put a lot of thought into what name to choose, because their meeting felt like something out of a wild dream. But the guy wanted to make the little girl even happier, so he suggested they start celebrating her birthday right now. I mean, the day you get a new name is a big deal. The Duke gave Leia a happy smile and wished her a happy birthday, because now she was his most precious daughter. His words made Leia blush, and her cheeks turned bright red. But then she suddenly jumped on the Duke and wrapped him in the biggest hug ever. The guy was shocked, but ever since Leia came into his life, he felt better and better every day. Cullen was still sitting on the floor, totally stunned, when Leia, clutching her bear, decided to run off and tell Jade everything. The Duke watched the girl go, still reeling from her hug. The sound of fast footsteps echoed down the hallway again as Leia ran to find Jade. The dude was asleep when a loud shout of his name came from somewhere nearby. Leia jumped on her bed, yelling about her new name. She showed the guy the toy and the letter, yelling that her father had now named her Letitia, and today they were celebrating her birthday. Jade liked the name, but apologized for not getting a gift ready in time because he didn't know about the celebration. The guy noticed the bear had beautiful gemstones for eyes, and his comment made La wary. Jade reached out and took the teddy bear. He pointed to the toy's eyes, where a red ruby and a blue sapphire were gleaming. Le dropped the envelope in surprise and the room went silent. Then there was an even louder scream when she finally realized what those gems were. The gemstones on the plush toy's face glittered in the lamplight as Lo started a serious conversation. The family was at breakfast, but Lu didn't touch her food and hinted to the man that he might spoil her if he kept giving such expensive gifts. The man laughed and talked about his plan to raise the girl in luxury so that other aristocrats couldn't even compare. Lee was freaked out by what he said, because that could make everyone hate her. Callan teased her, joking that it was all part of his master plan, so she'd never leave the Duke's mansion and stay his daughter forever. The little one didn't get how it all connected, because she could be his daughter even without the bling. Jade got a kick out of watching Lee and their dad bond over expensive presents. Suddenly, Lee spotted this crazy beautiful white cake with strawberries all over it. Cheyenne put the dessert on the table, bragging that the Duke himself whipped up the treat for her. All of a sudden, the whole staff of the estate crowded around the dining table. The staff all cheered, congratulating the young lady on her first birthday with the Levelton family. They were so happy for the kid. Lee was so caught off guard, she didn't know how to react. Jade and Cheyenne jumped in too, not wanting to be left out, and wished the little one a happy birthday. Callan grinned, bursting with pride that his daughter was turning 10 today. Lee was floored. She'd never experienced anything like this before and was completely speechless. But the next second, her heart fluttered, and she flashed everyone around her a sweet smile. Cheyenne cut a small piece of cake, while the maid prepared tea for the girl, who was celebrating her birthday for the first time and was over the moon. The Duke and Jade watched her, as their home was celebrating the arrival of a new family member, Letitia. Lee ate a piece of cake and decided she'd remember this day forever. But she hadn't forgotten about the book. After receiving the teddy bear, she recalled a side chapter in the novel, where a crowd of kids gathered in front of a toy store window before Christmas. Inside the shop, Duke Callan was picking out a gift for Jade and decided to go with a bear dressed in a military uniform. Cheyenne reassured the man that Jade would appreciate the gift his father had chosen for him. Callan exited the store, his appearance scattering the children in the street. The kids bolted around the corner of the house after she told the boss it was just some local poor kids, spooked by the shop owner showing up. Cullen chilled out once he realized he wasn't the reason they ran off. Shop owners sometimes suspect orphans of stealing and chase them away from the displays. The orphans peeked out from around the corner, waiting for the shop owner to head back behind the counter. Lee was in the crowd of kids, even smaller than when she'd first met the Levelton family. The Duke took a closer look at her, but couldn't figure out why she caught his eye. Cullen handed a gold coin to Cheyenne and told him to give the money to the shop owner, asking him to keep the lights on in the window tonight. Cheyenne didn't get the request, but as Cullen climbed into the carriage, he admitted he didn't want to ruin the holiday for other kids, since his gift wouldn't make Jade happy anyway. That kind of behavior was out of character for the boss, and the butler was surprised. Late that night, with a blizzard raging outside, little Lee stood in front of the shop window, watching the toys. Even living on the edge, she still found joy in the little things. It's been a month since Lee's birthday at the Levelton estate. The red-haired fortune teller case is closed, but Lee's been spending all her free time inside the estate. She was recovering well from her injury, but wasn't allowed outside, so she spent a lot of time learning to read. Sometimes Marianne would visit and stock Lou's wardrobe with new outfits from all the trendy shops. Over time, Le's health improved so much that the little one even gained some weight. They were sewing her new dresses, and according to the maids, it had already started snowing outside the estate walls. Every time Marianne visited, she was overwhelmed by Le's incredible beauty. She couldn't believe how much time had passed, and that Le was no longer the shy little girl who first walked through the estate gates. Lee told her all about the upcoming boat trip. Marianne tried to style Lou's hair and kept the conversation going about the upcoming trip. She was worried about Le, even though Jade promised to be careful on the trip he'd managed to arrange for the girl. Marianne finished the hairstyle and showed Lo in the mirror just how beautiful she was. The lady was musing that it's fascinating to watch the little one grow up in the family, but she's eager to see what kind of woman she'll become. Le looked at Marianne. The girl had recently learned that the lady can't marry while she holds the status of a saint, and figured that's why she looked so bummed out. Le tried to cheer her up, promising that when she grows up, she'll be just as awesome as Marianne. The lady was surprised, but Le confessed that Marianne is a person with a pure soul, and she wants to become just as radiant. Marianne started hugging Le, but told her not to pick up any of her bad habits. Jade appeared in the room, already ready for a boat ride. The lady laughed and told Jade to follow her example on how to properly enjoy wine, but her advice just embarrassed the guy. Lo stopped laughing and asked Marianne if she'd be willing to go for a boat ride with them. The girl kissed Lo on the cheek, but declined, because there was a celebration at the temple she had to attend. The lady saw the kids off to the porch, and they headed off together towards the boats. Lou grabbed Jade's hand, totally stoked, but she had no clue what this picnic was about to turn into. The white boat sliced through the water, making the sun glint off the waves. Le had never seen anything this beautiful before, and she couldn't hide how amazed she was. She wished Cullen could be here too, but he had to go to some political powwow he couldn't miss. Le remembered how bummed the Duke looked when he had to ditch the family picnic. Suddenly, they heard someone shouting from the side, asking if the kids were headed to Lennox Island. Jade turned around and saw 3 teenagers in a nearby boat, waving their arms like crazy. The dude recognized them, but he got pissed that they were heading to the same spot. These guys were waving their arms so wildly that their boat started rocking all over the place. Lee asked Jade who those teenagers were. Jade just brushed it off, saying they were just some upperclassmen from the academy he met at a birthday party once. The boat with the teenagers tried to catch up to the Leveltons, but the captain pulled a slick move and changed course. Lee was creeped out by the strangers, but she was more worried about why Jade wasn't going to the Academy of Sciences every day. Jade agreed with her, saying attendance points are super important. But his words surprised Lee, because she realized Jade was breaking the Academy's rules. Jade remembered how he aced the exam with the highest score ever, which totally shocked the teachers, so now he's basically free from school obligations. Jade declared that since their family are pureblood mages, he's good with self-study, and he spends the rest of his time with Lee, which kinda makes her an accomplice to his skipping. Lee daydreamed about how she could eventually go to the Academy of Sciences too, where tuition definitely costs a fortune. The girl giggled, because Jade just gave her some seriously bad ideas by spilling the secrets to gaming the Academy system. Jade reminded her that you always gotta stay within the lines, especially if you know when you can bend the rules and when you gotta stick to them. So Lee should start by learning all her letters. Jade promised her that once she learned to read, all the knowledge of the Empire would be open to her. Lee also mentioned that she learned to write the names of her family members, so soon she'd be able to exchange letters like they do in fancy aristocratic families. Smiling again, Leo promised she'd write Jade her first letter. Lou's bright smile was infectious, and Jade couldn't help but laugh along with her. The girl warned him not to even think about making fun of her. Suddenly, Jade asked Lou if there was anyone she really wanted to see. The little one paused, but immediately pictured Walter, a friend she'd spent a lot of time with in the capital's back alleys. The memory made Lou sad. She and Walter used to always have each other's backs, but now she's living a totally different life. But she assured Jade that she and the other orphans had made a promise. If they ever ran into each other on the street, they'd pretend not to know each other. Jade was confused, so Lou explained that they'd made that rule a long time ago because the streets are dangerous, and you can't put others at risk. And the promise also said that even if someone made it to a better place, the others shouldn't go looking for them. These thoughts made Lou hug her teddy bear tighter and get even sadder. She remembered that when she lived on the streets, she and the other kids tried to be fair and always divided their food into equal portions. Street fights between orphans were common, but they always remembered to stick together, so the squabbles were quickly forgotten. Lei pushed the past out of her head, smiled at Jade, and thanked the Levelton family for saving her from wandering the streets and trying to keep warm with a ragged blanket this winter. Jade realized Lo had lied during their first meeting when she talked about how warm the back alleys really were. The girl realized she'd let slip her lie, but decided to stick to her story and claimed that only one winter had been rough. Jade gave Lei a searching look, making her tremble. Calming down, Jade asked Lei not to dwell on the past, because now she had a new home. The little one blushed, believing that the more Cullen gave her, the more grateful she needed to be. The guy smiled and promised that he would always be grateful to her too. Jade moved closer and sincerely thanked Lo for coming to their house that one time, fighting through her illness, and being able to go boating with him. Lo's cheeks turned pink. She felt her heart flutter with warmth. She couldn't hold back and just hugged him, calling him brother for the first time. The boat hit the shore just as Lei was thinking she wanted to learn to write ASAP, so she could pour all her feelings into a card and relive this happy memory forever. The kids piled out of the boat and started walking along the shore of Lennox Island. Lee spotted some amazing bushes covered in bright flowers, grabbed Jade's hand, and dragged him along. The guy told her to chill out, because she shouldn't overdo it after being sick, and they had all day to have fun anyway. Lei walked up to a bush covered in blue roses and took a deep breath. The smell was incredible. Jade explained that the blue roses only bloom once a year, for just a few days, so they timed their trip to the island to be right in the middle of the bloom, when nobody else is around. The girl looked around. They were the only ones on the island, so Jade's plan to chill out was working perfectly. Jade sniffed a flower and got all worked up by saying there were a lot of bad rumors about them. The guy touched a flower and said the poison in blue roses can drive a person crazy, and anyone who comes to the island on the day they bloom is gonna kick the bucket. Lee was totally freaked out that Jade was hitting her with these creepy stories about Lennox Island, but Jade swore to her that all the scary stuff about the island was just local superstition. Lee figured these stories were like those urban legends about a fan killing you in your sleep if you don't turn it off. The kid touched the flower. She loved the color, but she felt bad that the plant had such a bad rep. Out of nowhere, Jade said they once found 2 bodies on the island, and those people died suddenly. The guy pointed toward some bushes, but Lee got spooked and hid behind him. Jade was getting a kick out of her reaction and started pointing again at the bushes where they found the dead guys. Lee's face went white after that messed up story, and she didn't ask Jade about the flowers anymore. The guy decided to take it easy on the girl and told her the flowers just changed color temporarily because of magic stones buried under the roots. But for a long time, people didn't know about the stones, so rumors started that roses with this super rare color were poisonous and could drive you insane, even though they're just regular flowers. A servant showed up in the meadow and called the kids to lunch on the shore, where a picnic was all set up. But when they got to the shore, it was some teens from another boat. They were stoked to see Jade since he hadn't been around the academy in ages. He wasn't thrilled with their visit, so he said, real cold, that he just wanted to chill with his sister in a quiet spot. Leah was standing behind Jade, and when the teens heard about his sister, they tried to get a look at her. The teens were being way too loud, so Leah figured she was still too nervous to hang out with the young noble crowd. The girl peeked out shyly from behind her brother, but didn't dare step forward. Suddenly, Jade took a sharp step back, pressing himself against the girl. He said firmly that it was time everyone went their separate ways. One of the older students walked up to Jade, clapped him on the shoulder, and said with a smirk that you always gotta introduce yourself to the young ladies. Jade wasn't happy, but he stepped aside and introduced Leah as his little sister. The little girl looked totally lost, but she bowed and quietly said her name was Letitia. Her little gesture had the upperclassmen clutching their chests, completely charmed by her sweet act. The guys started whispering, saying they had no idea the Duke's family had such a cute kid. One of the older guys stepped closer to her, all polite, and introduced himself as Lion. Lion's face seemed familiar to Letitia, but she couldn't quite place where she'd seen him before. Another student popped up in front of Letitia, bowed, and introduced himself as Percy. Percy was blown away by the little girl's manners. He just couldn't hide how impressed he was. Suddenly, a guy named Jax dropped to one knee next to Letitia, grabbed her hand, and laid it on thick about how she looked like a fairy. The dude leaned in, about to plant a kiss on the young lady's hand. But in a flash, her hand vanished from his grip. Jade scooped up Lee and pulled her away, making sure Jax couldn't lay a hand on the little girl. He said Lee was shy around strangers, then shot Jax a look that could kill, leaving him shaking in his boots. The other kids tried to smooth things over, but Jade promised them serious trouble if they even thought about touching his sister. The little girl was happy her brother was looking out for her, but she knew him well enough to know his threats were no joke. Desserts were spread out on the picnic blanket, and tea time continued. The maid and her assistant said goodbye to the nobles, then headed for the pier. The little girl happily munched on her sandwich, since it was specially made with all her favorite stuff. Jade poured Lee some tea, happy that after all this time, he and Lee could finally go for a walk, even if they ran into some unwanted company. He waved his hand dismissively at the guests, telling them to hurry up and finish their tea and scram. Percy tried to turn on the waterworks to get Jade to feel sorry for them, but he knew they were just ditching class to try and prove how tough they were. Jax was cracking up at Percy, because they didn't want to come to the island because of the Blue Rose Curse rumors. But Lion was totally stoked for the trip. Lo was keeping a close eye on Lion. She was positive she'd recognize him, and she hadn't seen him among the nobles before. Lion was keeping up the conversation with the other guys, but he still managed to smile at Lo now and then. Suddenly, Lion wanted to tell this hilarious story about Jade when the whole class was in detention, and the dude just slept through the whole lecture. Lee thought the classmates' stories were funny, but Jade threatened them again to shut their traps. The guys suggested Jade give Lei a tour of the academy, but he just smirked and said Lei would definitely attract some clingy pests there. Lei kept laughing at the teen's goofy behavior and realized her suspicions about Lion were unfounded. 'Cause he's super friendly. Out of nowhere, Percy declared that Lion was one of the best at the academy, which made the guy blush like crazy. Percy said Lion used to be super shy, but over time, his personality totally flipped, and now he's super outgoing. Lion laughed and thanked his friends for always being there for him. Percy got all fired up about the idea of Lady Lo having her debutante ball at his estate. Lo felt awkward, but Jade stepped in, shielding her from the silly suggestions, and declared that he and the Duke would decide which ball Lo attends first. Lee was surprised, but the guy promised that when she's all grown up, she'd be able to go wherever she wants without getting permission from him or her dad. The little one liked that plan, and hugging her bear, she gave a sweet smile. Percy clutched his chest, getting hit hard again by how charming she is, but Jade decided to shut that down and warned Percy to stop thinking about his sister's looks. The guys got spooked by Jade, but Jax noticed that Jade acts different around Ellie, and his face doesn't look so indifferent. Lee laughed again as Jade and the teenagers kept bickering about proper behavior within the family. Lion got up and decided to head over to the blue rose bushes to pick a small bouquet for his sister. Percy and Jax suddenly got all gloomy, and Lou didn't understand why Lion sounded so sad when he mentioned his sister. Percy asked Lion if he should go with him. Lion smirked and admitted he didn't buy the rumors about the blue roses, so he'd handle it himself. The guys cheered Lion on, saying they didn't believe the rumors either, but as soon as he disappeared into the bushes, their faces fell. The kid tried to find out if the teenagers were really okay. Jax faked a cheerful attitude, but Percy's face made it clear there was a secret between them. Once Lion was far enough away and started picking flowers, Jax confessed that his friend's sister had passed, so he just wanted to gather a bouquet for her grave. Jax remembered Lion's sister. She had long hair, and everyone thought she was incredibly beautiful. The guy mentioned that Percy and the girl were engaged, which is why Lion and they had been friends for so long. Percy's face was full of sorrow. He quietly whispered that Elise lived in the village, so they couldn't see each other often. Leigh was touched by the story, because in her past life, she also spent a lot of time alone, dealing with an illness. Jax's expression became even sadder, and tears started welling up in his eyes. But when the guy said Elise died of pneumonia, Leigh freaked out. Lion stepped out from behind the trees, holding a bouquet of blue roses. Lil felt awkward, realizing Lion had overheard the whole conversation while he was gone. Lion bowed his head and confessed he'd invited them to the island because his sister had always dreamed of seeing blue roses. The guy adjusted his cap, saying he was glad his friends were there, but he didn't want to bum everyone out with sad talk. He remembered finding a box among his sister's things the day before. Elise loved the color blue, so she kept a lot of blue things in the box. Lion looked at Percy and thanked him for still mourning Elise and not looking for a new bride. Percy appreciated his friend's words. Even though his family was rich, Elise meant more to him than anything and held a special place in his heart. Lion clutched the bouquet tighter, saying he was grateful to Percy's family for not demanding the jewels back when the wedding was off, which allowed Lion's family to restore their aristocratic status. An awkward silence fell over the teens, and Jax felt uncomfortable. Suddenly, one of the guys blurted out that they should all go visit Eliza. Leon's mood brightened, figuring that if Percy brought Eliza flowers, his sister would really appreciate the gesture. Leigh watched the guys from the side, impressed by how strong their friendship was. Leon wiped away his tears and changed the subject, asking Leigh if she was enjoying city life. The guy reminisced about when he first came to the capital from the sticks, and even after all these years, he's still finding amazing spots in the city. Years ago, Leon was a super shy dude, so when he got off the train, he was totally freaked out. He remembered the bell chiming in the blue clock tower, making the birds scatter all over the sky. Leon enjoyed the memories of the past, but his youth was gone, and now new memories awaited him. Leigh liked his story, even though the alley she lived in wasn't as pretty as the blue clock tower. Jade and Le bailed to the other side of the island, needed a break from those teenagers. Leigh was digging the trip, said she'd be down to hit the island again sometime. Jade was stoked that his sister was enjoying their little getaway. The kiddo started yawning. She was beat after such a long day, needed to crash. Suddenly, Lo got spooked, worried she'd fall asleep, and Jade would ditch her. She begged him not to forget to wake her up when it was time to head back. Jade was staring at her, but Leigh was totally lost in thought about what if she and Jade split up, like she'd end up on the streets. The dude snatched her hat and jokingly plopped it over her face. She looked at him, surprised, and he promised he wouldn't leave her stranded out there. Leigh clutched the hat in her hands. Her mood was totally lifted. After a while, Leigh cracked open her eyes and gazed at the blazing sun. She jolted awake, looking around, totally disoriented. How long had she been out? Over on the next patch of grass, Percy glanced toward the shore, where he could hear girls laughing. A boat was slowly making its way to the island, and Cullen was standing there, surrounded by young women. Leigh jumped up, stoked to see him, and called out to the Duke, waving him over to where she and Jade were. The Duke hopped out of the boat, thanked the girls for the lovely ride, and Leigh was already running toward him, all smiles, from the other side of the beach. Cullen waved goodbye to the girls, even though they kept shouting invitations for him to attend balls at their estates. The man scooped Leigh up in his arms, wondering how his kids were spending their time together. Leigh didn't buy that the Duke missed them. He was having way too much fun chatting up those girls who were nice enough to give him a lift. Cullen playfully pinched Leigh's cheeks and promised he'd run to the ends of the earth just for her. The teenagers, who'd been having a great time at their picnic, suddenly froze in terror when they saw the Duke. Cullen was still holding Leigh, but his gaze was full of arrogance as he scanned the teenagers. Leigh hopped down from the man's arms as he called Jade over. The Duke wanted to know why these weird dudes were hanging around his little girl without a chaperone, but the cold tone in his voice just freaked the guys out even more. Cullen looked at the booze with disgust, and his menacing glare made the teens hiccup with fear. Jax scrambled to hide the bottles, while Percy and Lion jumped to their feet, practically saluting as they swore they hadn't bothered the young lady all day. The Duke kept staring the guys down, demanding to know who they were. The guys were tripping over their words, so Percy tried to introduce himself first. Suddenly, the teens started arguing about what to tell the Duke, but Jade appeared next to Cullen and assured him that they just ran into some academy students. The man relaxed when he realized the teens weren't some leeches bothering his kid's vacation. Jade liked his dad's joke and agreed that it wasn't time to deal with the students just yet. These kids totally missed the Duke's humor. They were pale with fear, even though Leigh was finding the whole thing hilarious. The Duke decided to take pity on the students, and with a smile, promised not to mess with them. He was just worried about his daughter is all. The kids settled back on the blanket, ready to keep eating, but Jada was wondering how her dad managed to ditch the political meeting so early. Cullen sat down next to his son. His meeting wrapped up early, 'cause the king hasn't been as focused on work lately. The Duke glanced at the students. They were sitting there silently, even though he asked them what they were chatting about with his kids. Jax got brave and admitted that they were just telling the young lady about life in the capital. Leigh scooted closer to the Duke when he couldn't hold back and demanded the students spill what was bugging them, 'cause they looked scared and excited. Ever since Cullen showed up, Percy felt totally thrown, so he stood up and decided to take a walk around the island by himself. Percy headed towards the edge of the woods, while Jax started grilling the Duke about the magic business and the time when Cullen was head of the student council. Lee watched Percy go. She was worried, because he looked like something was really eating at him. Cullen distracted the girl, and she agreed to hear some details about the man's life. Cullen chuckled and finally agreed to give the students a little info for their thesis. But before the Duke could even start his story, a strong wind suddenly blew, making the little one shiver from the cold. Jade took off his jacket and draped it over Lee's shoulders. Lion pulled out a pocket mirror and said he'd run down to the river and signal the servants to come get them off the island. Suddenly, Le glanced to the side. She heard the sound of a stone falling into the river, somewhere behind the trees. Lion came out of the thicket and laughed at the little girl, explaining that Lennox Island has a lot of diving ducks that make a loud splash when they dive underwater. The guy assured them that the servants got his signal and would be arriving on the island soon, even though they still didn't know where Percy had wandered off to. The guys were discussing where Percy could have gone, especially if he'd had a bit too much to drink. Lee suggested to the Duke that they take a stroll to the blue rose bushes before they left the island by boat. The girl was dragging the man by the hand towards the flower-covered hill, eager to show him the beautiful view. Cullen was intrigued. He genuinely enjoyed spending time with the kids. Lee was so engrossed that it took her a while to notice Cullen's face grow tense. The Duke and Jade were staring at the other side of the hill, their expressions grim, but Lee couldn't figure out why. The little girl turned her head towards the bushes, trying to understand what was going on. But suddenly, Jade grabbed her, pulled her close, and told Lee not to look at the hill. However, one quick glance was all it took for Lee to see what had happened on the hill. Among the blue rose bushes lay Percy's lifeless body with cuts all over his arms. The girl tried to break free from Jade's grip, but he was stronger than her. Holding her tight, he asked the Duke what he thought about Percy's demise. The Duke walked closer to the bushes, examined Percy's body, and saw a small blade. However, he doubted the guy could have done something like that to himself. A smirk crept across the guy's face. "'Cause this trip just got a whole lot more interesting." Lee couldn't break free from Jade's grip, but Cullen's vibe was seriously setting off alarm bells. The man ordered Le to step back a bit, and then, a couple seconds later, she screamed for help to the other teens. The girl was freaking out that her dad and brother would be checking out the dead body while she had to distract the other kids. Jade went over to his dad and Le bolted towards the riverbank. The kids screamed so loud, the teens packing up their stuff jumped out of their skin at Lou's sudden appearance. Lei waved towards the hill as the guys ran up to her, but she couldn't get the words out to explain what happened. Jax and Lion followed Lou's gesture, and then their hearts just stopped at the messed up scene. The guys were speechless when they spotted Percy's body in the bushes. The teens were trying to process everything, but the Duke claimed the evidence he found suggested Percy might have brought this on himself with a sharp blade. Lion grabbed Jade. The guy couldn't believe Percy would do something so reckless, especially with such a bright future ahead of him. Jax, though, got a grip faster than Lion and started figuring out how it could have happened, since it's just them on the island and none of the staff are here yet. The kid was watching the guys, and she noticed Jax seemed to think Percy was to blame for whatever went down. Lion got bummed out. Now he was blaming himself, since talking about his sister sent Percy spiraling back into that dark place about Elise. The whole thing felt off to Lee. She couldn't believe that a year after Elise died, Percy would suddenly want to check out like that. The Duke watched Lo with interest as she stood there silently piecing together the day, remembering when Percy was still upbeat and happy. Cullen went over to the kid, worried about her scared look. Even though it's not the first time Lee's seen someone die recently, the kid didn't say anything to the man, she just grabbed his hand. Jax turned to Cullen and straight up implied that the Duke's family was the first to find Percy, even though all the island guests had been hanging out together until then. The Duke chuckled. Like, this college kid actually thinks his family planned the demise of some random dude. Cullen, who checked out the murder scene earlier, said that based on the blood trail on the leaves, Percy was dead way before he and his family even hiked up the hill. Suddenly, all eyes were on Lion, since he was the last one to head into the woods to signal the servants, and his time away lines up perfectly with Percy's time of death. Everyone looked at Percy's body. The Duke announced that right now, it looks like Percy meticulously planned his own death, and nobody here is to blame, but they'll all stay on the island while they wait for the police. Lion hugged Jax, trying to comfort him, but Lee, who was watching the teenagers, also started to suspect something fishy about the whole situation. The little girl gripped the Duke's hand tighter. Now she wanted to know why she was so sure that Percy's death was a fake. The Duke didn't like the little girl's quiet behavior and started to worry that she wasn't feeling well. The man took off his glove. He wanted to check if the girl had a fever after her recent recovery. Cullen reached out his hand to her forehead, even though Le tried to reassure him not to worry. Suddenly, when the man's hand pressed against her forehead harder, she felt a massive wave of dizziness. A vision flashed in Lo's mind. A strange house on a rocky cliffside next to the ocean. Out in the yard, some teenagers were messing around. A girl in a blue skirt was trying to get away from a guy. He tried to catch her, darting out from behind a different tree, which totally caught her off guard. Lee was just standing there, watching these kids having fun in the garden, but she had no clue whose memory she was seeing. She tried to get a good look at the guy's face, but it just turned into this crazy blur of faces, and then started to fade away. Lee snapped back to reality after Cullen had to call her name a few times. Jade and the Duke were worried about her, and he promised that as soon as the cops got here, they'd head home so Lee could get some rest. Lee glanced over at the shore where their boats were, and she was freaked out by that weird vision she'd just had with her eyes open. Jade put his arm around her and promised she could crash as soon as they got back to the estate. The guy was holding the little girl close, but Lee overheard that her family also thought this whole thing was a setup, a planned hit. The family stared out at the shore. They all knew there had to be someone else on the island, someone who got there earlier, because if the killer had come by boat, they would have heard it right away. Jade joked that maybe mermaids were to blame, but the Duke wasn't amused and just told the kids to wait for the cops. Lee thought about it. If the killer was on the island, they could still be among those who hadn't left. Suddenly, it dawned on the little girl that the vision she had might be the key to solving the case. Lee looked at Lion and Jax, figuring the culprit had to be the one who wasn't a very good actor. Lion was comforting his crying friend when Lee realized that the evildoer would soon face Cullen's wrath. The police arrived on the island, and a squad of guards took Percy's body away. A lot of the staff were saying the poor kid had a bright future ahead of him. Jax was talking to a cop and admitted that Percy was a skilled fencer, so he could have easily used a dagger to, end things. Lee stood next to the police captain, who was giving the Duke the side-eye. It wasn't the first time he'd been mixed up in some weird situation where someone ended up dead. The girl recognized the officer. He was also at the store when that redhead kicked the bucket on the sidewalk from a heart attack. Cullen asked the officer if they were free to leave the island, now that the police had questioned his family, so the captain had no choice but to give them the all-clear and let the Duke go. The captain peeled off to see Jax, so Cullen grabbed the kid's hand and headed towards the riverbank. Jax started bawling again, begging the cops to let them go home. The little girl watched everything, then tugged on the Duke's coat and confessed she felt really bad for Lion. Jade went back to the family, who were waiting on the hill, and the little girl asked if they could take Lion with them, because she felt terrible for the guy after hearing about his dead sister. Lee offered to comfort Lion on the way home, and her words totally threw the other teens for a loop. The girl looked at the Duke and pointed out that if Jax and Lion stayed together, they'd just end up blaming each other for not keeping an eye on Percy. The Duke was impressed by his daughter's kindness, so Jade nudged Lion towards the shore, which made the guy nervous. The Leveltons headed towards the riverbank, and the little girl was glad she hadn't left Lion in a bad situation with Jax. Leigh glanced back at Lion, and even though she wasn't completely sure, she was hoping her hunches were right. The cops were still swarming around the blue rose bushes, searching the area, but nobody was paying any attention to Jax standing there all alone. The family carriage arrived at the port to take the Levertons back to the estate. Lou grabbed Lion's hand, trying to get him into the carriage, but the kid was spooked and trying to find any excuse for the Duke's family to leave him at the port. Cullen wasn't having it, so he just shoved Lion into the carriage himself, because he didn't want to let La down. She was just trying to help the guy. Finally, the carriage left the port area as evening started to fall. The whole family and Lion sat in total silence as the carriage rolled along the fields. Cullen smirked at the little one. He knew his daughter was onto something big about the situation on the island. Lion was sitting across from the little one, and she already knew he'd taken Percy out with some low-down trick, but she didn't know why he'd done it. The silence was heavy, so Lion anxiously glanced at the scenery outside the window. The little one secretly looked at the Duke. She was dying to share her theories with someone. The carriage kept rolling towards the estate, while Lee tried to steel herself to get Cullen involved in exposing the killer, even though she was afraid he wouldn't want to understand the life circumstances that drove Lion to do what he did. The Duke closed his eyes, cool as could be, but Lee saw the weariness on his face. She remembered that in the Levelton family saga, he never found true happiness, so his life was pretty darn depressing. The carriage pulled up to a small rural plot. The little one looked around through the window and decided they'd arrived at the right spot. She tugged on the Duke's sleeve and got his attention. Lee fibbed, saying a decoration fell off her teddy bear and flew out the window. The girl reminded him that just that morning, Marianne had put a ribbon on the bear that was the same color as the one in her hair, so the Duke had to knock on the window. The carriage stopped on a country road next to an alley. The driver opened the carriage door, listened to the master's request about finding the ribbon, and took a silver coin as a reward. Lion got spooked by the stop. Sweat dripped down his face, and the guy couldn't get a word out. Suddenly, the guy jumped up and was about to bolt from the carriage, thanking the Duke for his time and help as he went. Lee was now absolutely certain that this was the exact back road where Lion was supposed to be all along. The girl rushed up to the guy, asking for just a minute of his time to answer one question. The guy slumped back in his chair as Lee asked him if they really hadn't met before. Lion started making excuses, saying he definitely would have remembered Lee, but when she firmly asked who he really was, he clammed up. The girl declared she'd seen Lion in the past, and her words made Jade uneasy. Cullen was also puzzled when Lee demanded Lion tell her the exact color of the clock tower at the train station. The guy reminded her that it was gold, and Lee agreed with that statement. And that's when Lee caught the guy in a lie, because back on the island, he'd claimed the tower was a different color. The girl realized she had a chance to nail the perp, and coldly stated that on the island, he said the tower was blue, and her words threw Lion into a major panic. The guy tried to hide his anxiety and lied, saying he might have been mistaken after he and his friends had a few drinks. Lou kept grilling him, throwing him off by confirming the tower was actually blue. The kid knew the clock tower was painted with special paint that looked blue at night and gold during the day. For the orphans, the tower's color meant a lot, so when they agreed to meet at the blue tower, it meant the gathering was planned for nighttime. The kid remembered a long time ago when her street friends invited her to watch the trains, and they snuck into the train station during the day. The day she and her friends ran around the station, the tower was definitely gold. But Leo also knew that trains stopped running at 6 p.m., and the station entrance was guarded. So the only people who could sneak into the station late at night were kids from the village doing petty theft. Lei decided to stop hiding the truth, because she'd already seen Lion at the Blue Tower meeting spot, since they grew up in the same rough neighborhood. The guy knew he couldn't argue with the girl's guesses, and silently listened to her assumptions about her knowing about his trip from the village near the station. Cullen proudly watched the kid as she came to the key conclusion, that instead of just one lion, there could be two. Leon was freaking out, realizing his secret was about to be blown, and he scrambled for an excuse. Suddenly, someone grabbed the carriage door handle from the outside. The little one didn't even have time to react before someone yanked her out in a flash. The stranger, dressed just like Leon, held a dagger to her throat and ordered everyone to stay put. The guy yelled at the Duke to let Leon go. The stranger was holding the girl, but she already realized that her visions weren't just about one person. In her vision, she saw two twin brothers having a blast in the garden with Elise. Cullen got the guy's attention, demanding he release the little girl, and then he'd take the guy out quick and clean. The Duke's words pissed off the twin. He gripped La tighter and threatened to cut her if the Duke didn't free his brother. The Duke was already summoning his shadow magic, skeptical that this kid had the guts to hurt his daughter. Out of nowhere, a dark blur zipped past Lee's cheek and slammed into the guy. The twin dropped the girl and went flying. He winced in pain, his dagger skittering away, but he couldn't get up to defend himself from the magic. Cullen stepped out of the carriage, absolutely livid that some backwoods punk dared to blackmail him by threatening his daughter. Magical shadows swirled around the Duke, amplifying his already furious mood. The Duke walked past Lee towards the twin. Black magic already hung in the air, binding the guy and preventing him from moving at all. The man started forming a spell, promising the guy he'd suffer a truly agonizing death. A scream came from the carriage. Lion leaped from his seat and tried to run out to help Lidden break free from the magic restraints. Jade jumped after the guy, then pulled a dagger from his jacket pocket, pinned Lion against the carriage wall, and held the knife to his throat. Both brothers were now in a hopeless situation. But suddenly, Lee's voice rang out from the street, begging her family to calm down and listen to her. Jade was clueless, but Lee demanded the twins spill the whole truth first. The little one looked at Cullen, begging him to grant her wish. The man dispelled the magic shadows and decided to let Lee continue untangling this weird case, which really surprised the kid. But then the Duke reached for his dagger and threatened to, seriously inconvenience the twins' hands for threatening his little girl. Cullen grabbed the guy's arm, but Lee started swearing to her dad she wasn't hurt at all, so Lidden was off limits. The Duke tossed the arm away like it was garbage, while Jade hauled Lion out of the carriage. The family dragged the twins into the hangar, where Cullen bound them both with magic ropes. The magic rope around Lion's shoulders tightened and morphed into a shadowy snake. Lei was surprised by the snake, because she thought the magic shadows looked like chains. The girl checked out the twins and noticed one of them was sitting there in completely soaked clothes. Jade was demanding answers. When did the twins switch places, and which one of them offed Percy? The brothers glanced at each other, but they weren't about to spill the beans. The Duke jumped into the conversation, demanding to know how his daughter found out about the twins' scheme. Lei tried to diffuse the tension, suggesting they should figure out what the heck happened on that island first. The Duke grumbled that Lo had this weird knack for getting under his skin, which made the poor girl uncomfortable. The guy pulled back some of the snake, letting one of the twins get his mouth free from the rope. Cullen grabbed the dude by the chin, promising that if he lied, his brother would seriously regret it. Jade pocketed his dagger and told his old man to cool it with the threats, when Lo could hear him. The man stepped away from the twin and ordered him to start telling the truth and answer his daughter's questions. The twin confessed that he iced Percy according to plan, where he and his brother swapped spots when Lion went to pick some flowers. So, on the island, Lidden went to hang with Percy's friends instead of Lion, keeping them busy while his brother hid in the blue rose bushes, waiting for Percy. After Percy was taken care of, the twins faked his death, so when Lidden went to signal the servants, the brothers switched places again. Lei heard the brothers' story, but she was worried about what they gave Percy that kept him from screaming. Lion said they weren't that dumb, so they prepped a cloth soaked in a special something that made Percy pass right out. The twin confessed that Percy was easy to trick, 'Cause they knew he was the only one giving Eliza blue gifts, so they figured out the guy's weakness. Lion bowed his head, but his voice was steady when he said he wasn't sorry for what they did. 'Cause Percy was a real piece of work who messed with their sister. The twins' family was dirt poor, so when they were little, their parents decided to put Leiden up for adoption with some distant relatives. Eventually, Leiden's adopted family went broke, so as a kid, he ended up living on the streets and learning how to pickpocket. One day, Leiden got caught stealing. Turns out he was trying to lift Lion's wallet, and that's how the brothers finally met. It hit him then. From that moment on, the brothers could live as one person. Lion confessed that after reuniting with his brother, they took turns attending the academy, so Leiden could reconnect with his noble heritage. Now Jade understood. The twins had trained to be identical, and when he met Lion at the academy, he seemed to act differently each time. But the brothers' story didn't distract Jade from the main question. Why did they decide to off Percy? Lion stated that Percy was the one responsible for their sister's death. When Elise was still alive, she grew more and more beautiful with each passing year. And it came to the point where young aristocrats were lining up to get engaged to her. Among the aristocrats were those willing to pay a penalty for Elise to break off an engagement and get engaged to another aristocrat. So when Percy heard these kinds of rumors, he decided to take advantage of the girl. The Duke listened intently to the twins' story and realized that Percy had always been an overly greedy guy who decided to exploit his family's wealth. Lo was touched by their story, but she couldn't grasp the true consequences of Percy's decision. Lion was taken by Liu's insight, like some old soul was trapped in a little girl's body, so he decided to trust her and lay out everything Percy did. When Percy caught wind of the rumors, he got hammered at a summer wedding one day and decided to spend time with Elise. But Percy's a total mess when he's drunk. Jade and Lo were floored when Lion confessed that Percy went to Elise that day with a bunch of other guys. The brothers painfully recalled that time, and Lion whispered that in wealthy families, all suicides get covered up as pneumonia deaths. That day, Elise called the brothers to her bedroom to confess everything that happened, but it didn't ease her suffering, and she ended her life. Lee realized this was all revenge, but Cullen was curious why the brothers acted this way if they hadn't even lived with their sister for very long. Lion blurted out that they only ever spent time together once at the family estate. Those memories of the three of them having fun and enjoying time with family were forever etched in their minds. Lee pondered that vision she had of the estate on the rocky cliff. Lion tried to cover for his brother, confessing that he killed Percy and would endure any dark magic experiments, just so Leiden could live. Callan scoffed, saying the rumors about his dark magic skills had blown up into horror stories about experiments. The twins looked at the kid. Their last question was how Le figured out their meeting spot. Colin and Jade stared down at the girl, making her feel totally awkward. The little girl remembered that during Percy's disappearance, they'd all been together the whole time. So, if someone did off Percy, it had to be someone who was with them on the island. But after the cops showed up and searched the whole island without finding anyone else, Lee figured the killer must have bailed before they arrived. When Lo and Jade were sailing to the island, the kid noticed a small bridge over the river, and she realized there was enough space between the water and the bridge to swim under it. Plus, the kid saw a tunnel under the bridge that went underground, and you could get to it straight from the shore. The Duke and Jade shot the twins some serious stink-eye. Leiden tried to say something, but his mouth was still sealed shut by that magic shadow. But what Lay said about being in the place the tunnel leads to? That freaked him out. The girl laughed. All the street kids know about the secret tunnel, but her deductions? They actually surprised the Duke with how sharp her thinking was. Lee admitted that anyone who knew about the Blue Tower would also know about the secret tunnel. That's how she cracked the case. Though she kept quiet about knowing secret info from that Levelton family tell-all, the kid looked at the twins. She needed to know the older brother's story, the one who could only think about getting revenge for his sister's death. The brothers were sweating it, wondering why the Duke hadn't punished them yet. They tried to find out what was coming, but the old man was in no hurry. He'd had a bad feeling about Percy's death for a while now. Back on the island, Cullen specifically asked Lou to bring Lion and Jex to the hill so he could figure out who the killer was and track him down. Jade tried to defend the brothers, saying that Leiden might not have known Lion's plans and might not be directly involved in the crime. The guy confessed he felt bad for the twins, seeing as he's an older brother now too, and he's got to look out for the little one. Jade walked up to the twins, laying out what could happen if anyone even thought about messing with Lee. The guy clapped the brothers on the shoulders, and with a sweet smile, promised that if anything ever happened to Lay, he'd waste no time taking them out. Jade looked at Lou and suggested the twins could be forgiven, since their actions weren't driven by bad intentions. But now that Letitia was deciding the brothers' fate, the girl was at a loss, because Jade was asking for forgiveness, but the Duke was hostile. The Duke implied that as a father, he insisted on their execution, which threw Jade off, and he promised not to interfere with his father's decision. Lo's mind was racing, because Cullen had already decided the guy's fate, but she wanted to fix everything and end the situation on a positive note. Remembering Elise from the vision, Lo felt that even though she'd never met the girl, she felt terrible about what happened to her. The girl looked at Cullen and declared that he should do what he could live with later. From the book, she remembered that Cullen was a hero who was forced down a bloody path, hunting down other criminals. But no matter what he had to do, he always continued down the path of a dark hero. Even though Cullen's past was hard, and now he shows no sympathy for criminals, no matter how noble their intentions, Lee hoped that now the man would make a different decision. Lydon and Lion are different from the murderers Cullen hunts. They were trying to clear their sister's name, so Cullen shouldn't stain his soul after hearing their story. The Duke approached the little girl, thanking her for being so persistent in finding the truth. Leah was gladdened by his words. She shielded the twins and asked the Duke to just hand them over to the police. But Cullen was interested in something else, which shocked Leah. He wanted to know the names of Percy's friends who mistreated Elise. The man leaned over the teenagers and demanded information, because he was sure the brothers would never forget the names of those who wronged her. The brothers looked at Cullen with doubt, as he tried to convince them to introduce him to the offenders. Cullen promised he'd let the twins go if they helped him out, but they still owed his daughter a debt of gratitude for her help. Jade smirked and sat down next to the older twin. The guy asked Lion to make sure he says hello to him next time they meet. The guys laughed. Jade was starting to like Lion's audacity, but suddenly, Jade threatened again that he'd take him out if he ever dared to speak to his little girl. Jade was amused by the situation, but he was curious why Lion killed Percy so easily, since revenge for a loved one should be much more intense. Lei went pale at Jade's statement, even though she was almost starting to change her mind about him. The Duke approached the girl and promised he'd personally handle the fallout from what happened to Elise. Lo knew from the book that Cullen was a devourer. The dark magic forces him to drain mana from people. There are a few specific situations where a devourer is allowed to take a person's mana. Usually, the targets are murderers or people who just recently kicked the bucket. But there are also those whose crimes are considered the worst of the worst, namely, harming the innocent soul of a young girl. Lei looked at the twins. She knew Cullen saw all criminals the same, but she agreed that Elise's abusers deserved to be punished. The Duke removed the magic shackles, and the twins, with tears in their eyes, were just grateful to be alive. They couldn't believe their luck, but Cullen hinted that those who've tasted blood once never really change. The man snapped his fingers and placed an invisible mark on the twins, promising he'd be watching them forever, and they wouldn't get a second chance. The teens nervously started checking each other out, while Jade glared at them, looking ready to throw down. Cullen walked over to the carriage and called for Lee to join him. The man scooped up the little girl and climbed into the carriage, tossing a "thanks for the upcoming treat" over his shoulder. The twins were left standing by the hangar, totally clueless about what the Duke was talking about. The man laughed, because Percy's corpse was fresh and met the Devourer's criteria. It clicked for Lee why her father had asked her to wait a bit on the hill, and only then call for help. Jade started closing the carriage door. He didn't feel bad for Percy, but he was still messed up after seeing his father devour the mana of someone he knew. Lion overheard the conversation from the carriage and tried to figure out what Jade meant, but the twin didn't get an answer, and the door slammed shut. Cullen was digging this new crime-solving gig. He didn't know what was in store for him if he stuck with Lee, but he was already loving their initial success. The guy sat the girl down next to him and announced he finally figured out who she was. The kid started freaking out, but the Duke just chuckled and said she was a total prodigy. His words left her speechless, so she just stared at him, completely shocked. Then Lee started waving her hands around, whining that she just guessed. But nobody believed her, since it wasn't the first time she'd shown amazing insight. The carriage rolled on as Jade mused that Lee didn't go to school, but had a knack for remembering all kinds of facts. The girl tried to defend herself, saying that if she was a genius, she wouldn't have grown up on the streets and still not even know how to write. Suddenly, her gaze fell on the city streets the carriage was entering. The little girl saw two orphans trying to keep warm with an old blanket. The carriage drove down the main street, and the girl realized this winter was going to be brutal. Jade watched the little girl's serious expression, and he was concerned that she cared so deeply about the street kids. The Duke ruffled the kid's hair, but assured her they needed to visit a scientist friend who'd test her abilities. But the man's words didn't reassure the little one. Now she figured if she bombed the test, Cullen might ditch her. After a while, the carriage rolled into the courtyard of the Levelton family estate. Cheyenne was already in the house's entrance hall, so he politely opened the doors and greeted the family. The butler tried to figure out why the young lady looked so tired, but the Duke proudly brushed past and declared that their Le was a true prodigy. Cheyenne didn't catch the exact reason for the Duke's mood, but he decided not to pry. Late in the evening, when everyone in the estate had gone to their bedrooms, Le lay alone on the bed in her room. At dinner tonight, the Duke did nothing but brag about Lee's skills. The girl jolted upright in bed when there was a knock at her door. Jade's face appeared in the doorway, but the guy wasn't rushing to come into the bedroom. Figuring he'd check in on her, the guy walked over to the bed and asked why Lee always got so bummed out when they drove past the intersection where she used to live. The little girl hugged her teddy bear tight. Deciding to trust her brother, she confessed she'd spent a lot of tough times in the alley behind that intersection. Lee clutched the toy to her chest, saying every time she sees that intersection, or even just thinks about the past, it sends a real chill down her spine. Jade asked her to tell him everything. Lee told Jade not to worry about her. Even though she misses her friends, she still remembers the orphan's golden rule. If someone finds a good home, don't go looking for each other. Her brother wished the little one sweet dreams and left her room. The girl flopped back onto the bed. Even though she wasn't really sleepy yet, she started staring at the ceiling, thinking back to the vision she had when Cullen touched her. Lee looked at her palm. Unlike the book, where things went a certain way, everything's different now, and she doesn't know what to do about these visions. But after a rough day, Lee still drifted off to sleep pretty quickly. Life at the estate went on as usual, but Cullen never brought up Lou's genius again during that time. After reading the newspaper, the Duke suggested Lo take a walk around town. The offer thrilled the little one. The Duke suggested going to the cafe, where Lo had been with Marianne, after he finished up some work. Lee immediately pictured all the tasty desserts she'd gotten to try at that cafe. Without waiting, the girl ran to her room to change, but Shion asked her to get help from the maids. Cullen was glad that a rambunctious kid, so unlike other aristocratic children, had come to his house. While the family was getting ready to head to town, a carriage arrived at the estate entrance. The maids changed Lou into an autumn outfit, which pleased Cullen even more. The girl shyly asked the man if she could hold his hand, which filled Cullen's heart with even more love for her. The man couldn't resist and pulled Lo into a tight hug. The girl was stunned, but still asked the Duke to hold her hand. Lee grabbed the man's palm, but this time, no new visions appeared in her head. The girl didn't let go, even though after the events on Lennox Island, she tried to hold the man's hand every time. But like today, no visions appeared. The carriage set off with the family, although Lo was saddened because she didn't know how to unlock her ability again. After a while, the Leveltons arrived on one of the city's main streets. A massive iron sign loomed before them. La squinted, trying to read the name of the research institute. Cullen approached the doors of the institution and promised that Dr. Sibel would only conduct a small test. Lee realized she'd been tricked with the cafe visit, just like her parents used to trick her into going to the dentist in her past life. The Duke dragged the resisting Lo into the institute. After all, he'd planned all this for her sake. The girl caught the man in a lie and tried to fake tears, but the Duke was already climbing the steps to the doctor's office. A blonde guy greeted Levelton and told them to head to another office. Looking him over, Lee decided he was way too young to be a doctor. Cullen ushered the kid into the office, warning the doctor that security was patrolling outside while he was gone. And if anything happened to his daughter, the doctor would seriously regret it. Le grabbed onto the man's coat, but he promised he'd be back as soon as he wrapped things up, so she needed to hang out with the doctor for a bit. The Duke wasn't having it. He pulled her off his coat and snapped that he'd be back soon. Then, he vanished through the door, which slammed shut with a loud bang. The guy introduced himself as Dr. Sibel and tried to win her over with his friendly attitude. Lei puffed out her cheeks and grumbled her name to the doctor, clearly annoyed. The doctor chuckled, saying that she looked like a grumpy little puppy when she was upset. The guy sat her down at his desk while she checked out his doctorates, which he'd gotten at a young age. The doctor's desk was covered in all sorts of scientific gadgets. He promised that people like him help people like Lee, because if someone has the potential to be a genius, it needs to be nurtured. Sibel sat down across from her and said that he and the Duke just wanted to help, and the test wouldn't affect Lou's life at all. The kid was trying to wrap up the meeting with the doctor and assured him there was nothing special about her. The guy realized the girl was worried about the results and told her that all kids from noble families go through this procedure. Sibel stated that all loving parents believe in their children's potential, which is why they bring them to the institute. The guy started rummaging around on the desk, explaining that the Duke wasn't trying to get anything out of this test, unlike other parents who are desperate to find some kind of genius in their kid. The doctor looked under the table and said from down there that if the test reveals the right skills, he's obligated to help Lee manage the curriculum. The kid anxiously squeezed her toy when Sybil asked what format she'd prefer to answer his questions in. Suddenly, there was a crash that scared Lee, because the doctor lost his bearings and banged his head hard on the desk. The guy grabbed his head, but reassured Lee not to worry about him. The doctor found the stack of papers he needed and suggested they start the testing. Sybil had set up a bunch of challenges. Some were about paying attention, and Lee had to find her way out of a maze. Then, when they started playing chess, the doctor would randomly quiz her with math problems. Lee tried to answer his questions, but she didn't know all the answers, because she hadn't spent much time studying, either in this life or her past one. But she was curious to learn new stuff. Even while playing chess, she asked a ton of questions about how the pieces moved. The doctor calmly watched Lee's reasoning and didn't distract her by suddenly changing the subject. After 2 hours, their test tasks were done, and Sibel asked Lee to wait in the office while he analyzed the results. Lee stayed at the table. She wasn't tired after all the tests, so she figured being a genius was easy. She started dreaming about how geniuses work a lot with different numbers, inventing and creating new things. Waiting for the doctor bored Lee, and the little girl started worrying about Sibel's words about how many parents get disappointed when they find out their kid isn't a genius. Lee decided that Cullen wanted her to get involved in his work that way, since he'd once promised he'd listen to her opinions. But what if her skills aren't needed and the guy kicks her out of the mansion? Though, Lee figured she might get stuck here as one of the lowest servants, scrubbing floors all day. These depressing thoughts almost made Lee burst into tears, especially since the test results could take days. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, and the little girl turned towards the door. Cullen walked into the study, having finished up his work. The guy sat down next to Lee, saw her upset look, and demanded to know what the doctor had done. The girl tried to hold back tears, but couldn't hide the truth, and confessed she wasn't a genius. Cullen was floored when his little girl said she hadn't answered a single question on the test. The Duke tried to comfort Lee as she started explaining that with her normal memory, she wouldn't be as helpful in his business. Lee stopped crying, but she was still worried that Cullen now knew she wasn't some kind of prodigy. Cullen held the girl tighter, pulling her close. He told her she was his greatest joy as a father, so things like test results didn't matter. The Duke hugged the little one, explaining he just wanted to see if she had any special talents, so he and Jade would know how to help her develop. Lee snuggled into the man. She knew she was different, being adopted into the Duke's family. Cullen explained that sometimes people are just born with a knack for learning certain things, but those with strong mental abilities have to keep them in check, or else it can lead to some serious mental health problems. So Cullen decided to prepare in advance for the possibility that Lee might have some abilities, since Jade didn't show any strong skills at her age either. The Duke hugged the little girl close and promised he'd be happy with anything she accomplished, because every parent dreams of a kid like her. The man patted Lee on the back and admitted that not everyone can be a genius. Some people gotta be a little less gifted. The Duke told Lee not to worry and just live her life carefree, spending his money, because she's the daughter he always wanted. Lee wasn't too sure about getting comfort from a guy like that, but at least she stopped crying. Cullen reminded her about his promise to take her to the cafe, and her mood instantly brightened up. The guy decided to wait for the doctor to get his take, since he was already lugging a huge stack of papers out of his office. Dr. Sibel was worked up. He'd analyzed the results, but their conversation about it was going to be a long one. The Duke rushed the doctor, who nervously dumped the result sheets on the table and said that even though Lo wasn't a straight-up genius, her abilities were seriously high level. The doctor rummaged around in the documents a bit more and announced that the girl had a talent that would lead her to giftedness. The Duke couldn't take it anymore and slammed his fist on the table, demanding the doctor spell out exactly what he meant. Sibel handed Cullen the assignment sheets, certain that Lee had a knack for learning different languages and killer logical skills. Lee and the Duke were totally lost while the doctor rattled on about all the girl's special traits, but he finally recommended she focus on studying computational sciences. But all Cullen heard from the doctor was that his daughter was definitely a genius. In an instant, the Duke's face lit up. Now he was certain about Lo's incredible talent. Cullen poked Lei on the nose, telling her that even if she was a bit of a ditz, being smart and rich would make her life way more interesting. The man started to lead the little girl towards the exit, but the doctor asked the young lady to stay and have a chat with him. This request pissed off the Duke, and he gave a menacing hint that the doctor had already spent enough time with his daughter. Sybil tried to explain himself, asking Le to come to his office. The Duke's mood soured. He couldn't understand why they couldn't discuss everything right there. The doctor, scared stiff, started to stutter, but he asked the man to butt out so Lou could freely talk about her abilities. Lo dashed to the doctor's office, even though the Duke's glare burning into her back made her skin crawl. The girl had never been in a science lab before. The whole place was packed with books and research equipment, so Lei was blown away by what she saw. The doctor mentioned that there were special programs for people like Lee, but the Duke probably wouldn't let her attend since he's so overprotective. The kid was checking out the lab, but something felt off about the whole room. Sybil took a seat at the desk and announced that Lee was about to take her final test. Lee got curious about what kind of puzzle the doctor had cooked up for her in the lab. The girl started examining the room, noticing that all the furniture and walls had a lot in common with the room next door. Lee figured that if you cleared out the extra stuff, the rooms would be almost identical. Lee focused on spotting the differences, and her eyes immediately landed on the painting hanging near the entrance. The kid walked closer to the wall to get a better look at the forest scene. She remembered there was a similar painting in the other room, but it showed two paths forming across. But the painting in the lab showed a fence surrounded by flowers. Lee's brain started piecing things together. A cross in one painting, a circle in the other. It all had to lead to the solution. Lee asked the doctor if there was a book in the lab with a title that mentioned a cross and a circle. Sibel went to the bookshelf and pulled out a thick book, amazed at Lo's outside-the-box thinking. The kid took the book, but didn't quite believe she'd cracked the code, so she looked around again. On the bookshelf, Lo noticed a circle symbol hidden behind a book. The girl put the pieces together. The paintings gave her a cross and a circle, but after finding the book, she found another circle. Lee was running through every possibility of what two circles and a cross could mean when it hit her. It was the infinity symbol. She asked the doctor for a book called Infinity, which totally surprised the guy. Sibyl pulled out a white book called Endless Admirer and showed it to Lo. Opening the book, Lo found a congratulatory note. The doctor praised her for solving the whole mystery, even though her first guess was also right. Cullen was trying to wait patiently in the institute's hallway, but he was about to lose it. The doctor pointed to an address on the back of his card and told Lo to come by if she needed anything. Sybil clapped Lo on the shoulder, admitting that a lot of people didn't understand him when he was a kid, so he'd be happy to help Lo adjust to her new abilities. The man crouched down in front of the girl and promised that, as a teacher, he'd always find a way to help her if she came to his lab. Sybil reminded Lei that the Duke is always proud of her talent, no matter how big or small it is. That kind of insight blew Lee away, and she figured the doctor could definitely read her mind, since she was worried about how Cullen would react. Suddenly, there was a god-awful crash that made Lo and Sybil jump. The Duke's patience had run out, so he was banging on the lab door with everything he had, because he suspected something was up with his daughter being in some guy's office for so long. The doctor panicked and ran to open the door, swearing he was just giving Lee another test. Lei showed off the doctor's card, but Cullen wasn't impressed with the guy's behavior. Cullen looked at Lo when she spoke to him. The little one confessed she appreciated how proud the Duke was of her. Cullen ruffled Lee's hair, touched by her promise to stay with him forever. Even then, Cullen managed to hint that Lee should call him Dad, so he wouldn't feel awkward. Sybil stood anxiously by the desk as the Duke turned to leave the office, calling out a goodbye, saying he'd send an assistant to settle the bill. Now Lee was in a good mood. She waved goodbye to the doctor and got excited for their upcoming trip to the cafe. The Leveltons left the institute. Sybil watched them go, and as soon as they were out of sight, he smirked ominously, because his suspicions about Lee were right. The man walked to another bookshelf and pulled something from a hidden compartment. Though the results impressed Sybil, he still hoped the girl could find the box with the red flower. The man inhaled the floral scent of the red flower petals, completely lost in the moment. Remembering his secret guest, the man approached a hidden door and began to slide the bookcase aside. Inside the secret room, set up as a clandestine lab, a blue container held a person. So Lei didn't crack the big question. Where's the real Dr. Sybil? The man entered the secret room, dispelling a magical disguise. A flower tattoo appeared on his hand. He was bummed Lei hadn't figured it all out, but now he had some different plans for her. Sybil tapped on the blue container where the real Dr. Sybil was sleeping, and with a smirk, asked him to keep lending him his name for a little while longer. After spending time with the girl, Sybil was convinced she'd grow up to be one hell of a woman. As soon as Cullen dropped the kid off at the institute for testing, he went about his business, and now he was watching one of the academy students. The student calmly watched the argument at the academy gates, not caring about the reason for it. Nearby, a group of teenagers started gossiping about Percy's early death, spreading rumors that he did it because of his love for his dead bride. The student finished his cigarette, amused by Percy's rash act, since he thought there were plenty of women in their world. The guy headed to the carriage, even happy that Percy would never know what he did with his bride during that weekend at the estate. The student tossed his cigarette, not noticing the stranger who appeared behind him. Suddenly, a powerful hand grabbed the kid and slammed his head into the sidewalk. Cullen had already unleashed his dark magic, and he was straight up gloating over the student, 'cause he'd come to collect his soul. The kid was terrified, but he wasn't strong enough to push the Duke off him. The man conjured a magic rope and tied up the kid, then sneered at him, saying only lowlifes try to sweep the murder of a woman under the rug with money. Cullen pressed his foot down on the student, grinding him into the ground. Before this meeting, he did his homework and found out this scumbag has a ton of unsolved crimes against women on his hands. The man didn't hide his disgust. He was terrifying the kid with stories about exactly what would happen when he decided to devour his mana, which sent him into a state of pure panic. The student tried to push the Duke's foot off him. His mouth was bound by a dark shadow. No one could hear him, so Cullen promised again that his death would be agonizing. The kid managed to twist around, but he was slammed back down, and the Duke declared that for his daughter's sake, he'd be rid of monsters like him. Cullen grabbed the black noose binding the kid's neck and decided there was no point in dragging out the punishment. The Duke summoned the magical spirit of a dark serpent, ready to devour the student's mana. Cullen glanced at his watch. After dealing with that little problem, he still had time to hit the university and pick up the kid. The man turned around without a word and headed towards the city's main drag. After a long day, Cullen and Lee ended up at a cafe, where the man asked them to bring out every cake they had. The kid only asked for one slice of dessert, but he looked at her funny and asked if she was sure that was enough. Lee thought about it. Now that she's a genius, doing all this thinking, she could probably handle 2 slices of cake. The Duke turned to face the window. The girl didn't understand what could have upset him. Suddenly, the man handed the menu back to the waiter and demanded they bring out all the desserts. Before long, the cafe staff put together a huge platter with desserts of every flavor you could imagine. Lee was ecstatic. She hadn't even realized how hungry she was. The kids started sampling the treats, but she was curious why the Duke had come back for her in such a good mood, and with his tie tied differently. Cullen appreciated his daughter's attentiveness again. After the incident with the student, his clothes got rumpled, and Cheyenne fixed them up. The man crossed his arms, fibbing that he'd just run into an old pal and had a good heart-to-heart. Lo kept munching on desserts as Cullen noticed a bunch of cops sprinting down the street towards the Science Academy. The Duke watched the officers go. He was sure the student's body wouldn't give them anything, and the verdict would be cause of death unknown. Cullen decided not to sweat the crime in the capital and just enjoyed watching the little one eat. The man admitted he wished every day could be like this, just spending time together, but Lo didn't get what he was getting at. The Duke showered Lo with compliments, telling her how sweet she was and how much he wanted to make her happy. Lo's cheeks flushed red, but she was glad she was making the Duke happy. Even though Cullen wanted her to call him Dad, he didn't push it right now. The day was going too well. Finishing their lunch, Cullen and Le left the cafe, giving the staff a polite goodbye. The Duke asked the little girl to come with him on a trip. A carriage was parked next to the cafe, where Cheyenne and Jade were waiting for the little one and her dad to join them. Jade was in a great mood and promised Leah that the day would get even better for her. As evening approached, the family set off in the carriage. Even though Leah was wearing an autumn coat, she was starting to get cold. Leah looked out the window. She noticed an alley near the intersection and realized the cold came from her bad memories of living on the streets. The carriage rolled a little further down the street when Leah saw something unusual at the intersection. The wagon came to a screeching halt on the road. Leah excitedly got out of it because the street had changed. The little girl didn't wait for the rest of the family to join her and ran towards the intersection. The girl drifted back into memories, remembering how the owner of one of the houses would often pretend not to notice the orphans scavenging for scraps in the trash. Sometimes the kids would hang out in a warehouse, huddled together in a circle, trying to stay warm under a tattered blanket. But all those places were gone from the street. A new, towering building now stood where the slums used to be. The little one looked around and spotted a nameplate next to the back entrance. She'd learned enough letters to realize the sign identified the building as a children's home. Lee felt too shy to just walk in, so she peeked inside through the window. Inside was a large living room with a fireplace, warm rugs, and tons of toys. The Leveltons came over to Lee, and the Duke explained it was a project he'd come up with alongside Jade to make the little one happier. Jade confessed that he wanted to erase the worry from Lou's face, the kind she got every time they drove past this intersection. So, he decided to do something that would wipe away the sadness from the little girl's face. Callan leaned down to the kid. He'd figured out a while ago that Lo wanted to mess with the connection the orphans had. Lee remembered a few days ago, Jade came to her room, and they talked a lot about how the orphans were getting used to the good life. The fact that it wasn't a secret anymore freaked her out, so she snapped at Jade. The Duke looked around the place. He promised he'd paid all the homeowners on this street a fortune when he bought up the land to make one big building. Callan assured the kid that only children could come into this orphanage and be totally safe there all winter long. This really got to Lee, and she was super grateful to the family. Callan seized the moment and told Le that as a father, he'd be happy to help her, even though he really wanted to be her dad. From somewhere nearby, Jade asked her to call him bro. Le got flustered. She hadn't called Callan dad before, and she wasn't used to it, because she could leave this family any minute. But she couldn't help herself. She jumped into Callan's arms and called him Dad. She hugged him and thanked them for giving her a dad and an older brother who cared about her. Lee jumped up and hugged Jade. Even though the Levelton family could look intimidating sometimes, she felt really good with them. Her brother patted the little one on the head and told her to ditch all the sad thoughts she had connected to this crossroads. The family got back in the carriage, and Jade said he'd been trying to find Walter, but the word was he'd left town recently. Lee didn't get too worried about her friend, but Jade asked her to be sure. Did she want him to track the kid down? Leigh was happy and assured Jade that Walter knew how to make it in this world, so there was no need to worry about him. Lee looked out the window. After that whole thing with the Demon Slayer, who was supposed to off Walter, the boy's fate had changed. It was starting to get dark as the carriage rode to the estate, and Lo was thinking that she believed Walter's life would get better. The papers were full of stories about members of noble families dying from unknown causes. Lion figured these news stories were the Duke's doing and told Lyddon about it. Her brother was doubtful, because Cullen and the doctor were similar in some ways. They had a similar vibe, and their actions were alike. The brothers were at the station, waiting for their train. Lyddon was worried if Lady Lay got their gift, to thank her for saving their lives. The twins got bummed out. They couldn't tell Le that Percy's demise was all Dr. Sybil's scheme. Lion flashed back to the day he saw Percy and his buddies hanging out in one of the academy gardens. The dude was furious, wanted to take Percy out, but then Dr. Sybil's voice cut through his thoughts. He was right behind him. The doctor walked up to him and, sharp as ever, noticed he was only staring at Percy. Percy and the students were having a blast, but Sybil already knew that that student was responsible for Lion's sister's death. The doctor started playing Lion like a fiddle, whispering in his ear that he could help him deal with Percy. After that first meeting, the doctor's plan went off without a hitch, and Percy got what was coming to him, but not without some hiccups. The Duke's family got involved, along with Letitia. Once the plan was done, the doctor was already waiting for the twins back at the lab. When the brothers went to the doctor, they had to spill everything, especially how the little girl figured out their scheme. From their story, the doctor realized the Duke had a soft spot for the kid, letting the twins walk, which he found pretty amusing. Even though the plan wasn't perfect, the doctor tasked the twins with delivering a red flower to the Duke's estate. But when the brothers snuck onto the estate grounds, they decided to ditch the doctor's orders. The teens left a blue rose at the estate gates as a symbol of gratitude, apology, and, let's just say, trouble. A train pulled into the station. Lion reminded his brother they screwed up by not leaving the red flower, but they couldn't risk trying to warn Le that the doctor was onto her. Liden was pissed his brother told Sybil about the little girl, so they needed to skip town before the Duke found out the truth. Boarding was ending, so the brother told Lion to get a move on. Lion froze. Liden went back for his brother to drag him onto the train, but that's when they realized they were too late. Dr. Sybil showed up at the station, all chummy with strangers, but he was clearly there looking for the twins. Liden ducked his face under his cap and dragged his brother away before anyone spotted them. But the guys barely took a few steps before the doctor showed up behind them. Sybil grabbed Lion's arm so the brothers couldn't bolt. Lion tried to apologize for leaving town without saying goodbye, but the man wouldn't let go of his arm. The doctor freaked them out by bringing up Letitia, and Lion stopped trying to pull away. Sybil bragged that the girl came to him when he opened the lab, so he's just waiting for her to grow up and really show what she can do. The man tried to pull Lion closer, but the guy resisted, because he needed to know if the girl was okay. The doctor smirked. He's got some big plans for the girl, so he won't be messing her up for now. The man finally overpowered Lion's resistance and reminded him that he didn't ask for a reward for helping take care of Percy, just a little favor from the twins. Boarding the train was ending, and only a few people seeing them off remained at the station. The last passengers were scrambling for the train cars, but the doctor wasn't letting the guys go. He was furious they hadn't delivered the red flower to the Levelton estate. Lion dropped the newspaper when Sybil reminded him that everything he touched turned into a complete disaster. The man grabbed the guy by the throat, now that they screwed up their deal and the Duke exposed them. No need to leave any loose ends. Liden jumped in, pulling his brother aside, shielding him from the doctor. The situation amused the man. He already knew the guys were heading north, but Ladine tried to lie, saying they were going west for work. Sybil held up the train tickets he'd swiped from the guy's pocket and laughed at his pathetic attempts to weasel out of it. The twins were terrified. Lion frantically checked his jacket pockets, but the tickets in the doctor's hands were the real deal. Suddenly, shouts about a fire erupted throughout the train station. Passengers were desperately trying to escape the station because several cars were engulfed in massive flames. Liden demanded the doctor give them back their train tickets. The guy tossed the tickets to the brothers, but he wasn't backing down, so he activated his magic. The magic hit the brothers hard, making them dizzy, but they remembered the doctor's warning. He'd take their lives for those tickets. Sybil decided not to stick around the station. Before leaving, he thanked the guys for at least setting up a meeting with Letitia. Lion blacked out and hit the ground, while Liden tried to fight off the magic. Liden watched the guy walk away, promising them as a parting gift that he'd let them die without pain. The station was engulfed in orange flames, but the twins lay motionless on the platform after the doctor's magic drained their mana. During breakfast, Jade read in the newspaper that the train station explosion was the hottest topic in the capital. According to the police report, the explosion mysteriously occurred in a freight car with no passengers. The fire was quickly put out, but the next morning, when the guards were checking the station, another strange thing happened. One of the station supervisors found a mysterious message during his morning rounds, and it scared him half to death. There were 2 bodies near the clock tower, nestled amongst the blue rose bushes. Jade finished reading the morning paper, but according to the article, the discovery of the bodies had really freaked out the locals. Cullen listened to his son, and based on info from a friendly officer, he learned the teens at the station were Lyon and Ladine. Jade flipped the paper to other news. He felt bad that Lion, after getting revenge for his sister, never managed to find happiness. The Duke didn't understand how his son could think killers were capable of being happy. The guy looked out the window at the courtyard, where Lo was playing with a ball, and admitted that lately his life had become wonderful, despite everything he'd done in the past. Lei was in a good mood when she caught the ball, so Jade's heart swelled with happiness when he saw her like that. The Duke admitted he doesn't always know what Jade's thinking, but Jade asked him not to get too involved in his life. That tone set off a fight between father and son, so Cheyenne tried to calm the master down, but he was already angry and ordered the butler to stand there silently. Cullen ended the conversation, rolled up the newspaper, and ordered Cheyenne to get rid of the article so Letitia wouldn't find out anything about Lion and his brother. The Duke tried to calm down, telling himself the incident would soon be forgotten with so much happening in the capital. But Cheyenne sensed his anxiety. Cullen confessed that, lately, he's had this feeling like someone's watching him. He just hasn't found the key piece of evidence yet. The man gripped the chair armrest anxiously, worried that the souls of those he'd killed were getting back at him for showing mercy to someone. The butler tried to convince the Duke he was just overreacting. Lei was playing with a maid in the courtyard, while Cullen watched her, and after thinking it over, ordered that the little girl never be left alone, and that meetings with Marianne only happen on the estate. A few weeks had passed since the explosion at the station. Winter had arrived, so all of Lou's entertainment now took place only on the estate under Cheyenne's supervision. Being stuck inside was boring, so Lee tried to get permission to go play outside, But Cheyenne didn't want to let her go for another walk, in case she got sick. The little girl tried to guilt-trip the butler, promising to only play outside for a little while the sun was still high in the sky. The man couldn't resist her sweet look and agreed to let Le go outside for a short time. Le ran towards the exit, forcing the maid to chase after her to put on her warm coat. The servants got my walking around stuff ready, but Lee was complaining she'd be all clumsy and bundled up. Once outside, the little tyke decided to build a snowman, while a couple of maids watched her from the sidelines. The snowball Lee was working so hard on suddenly bounced off towards the fence. Lee took off after it, telling the maids not to sweat it. After grabbing the snowball near the fence, Lee spotted some blue petals in the snow. There, on a stone tile, was a blue rose, all nice and neat, with the thorns clipped off. The girl gave the flower a good look. She couldn't figure out how it got there, seeing as blue roses ain't been in season for ages. She remembered Lion, and how he picked a whole bouquet of 'em that day on the island. The maids called Lee back closer to the house, so the little one put the flower back down. The blue rose stayed there by the fence as Lee ran back towards the house. Lee spent all her time at the estate, studying with tutors and doing homework. Cheyenne peeked in to see what the little one was up to, but Lee was already finishing a drawing of the estate for her teacher. The butler asked what ideas she had for the drawing, and Lee specified a few small details about the color. The man praised the girl for her work and asked her to show the estate to the Duke later. The little girl hid the drawing and grumbled that Cullen was too good at drawing, so her picture would only make him laugh. Lee noticed that Cheyenne often spoke in the same manner as Cullen, but the man simply praised her efforts. They lit a fire in the fireplace in the living room. Lee was happy for the company while she worked, but she felt awkward that the butler was sitting with her when there was still so much work to do around the estate. Lee knew that Cheyenne managed the entire estate instead of Cullen, so he wasn't the one who should be checking her homework. The girl stopped drawing, worried that if the Duke found out Cheyenne was entertaining her, he might punish the butler. She imagined how furious Cullen and Jade would be if they realized she wasn't doing her homework herself. But Cheyenne just chuckled, because the Leveltons are probably going to be mad at him just for getting to hang out with the young lady more. Le got what he meant, because her family's super possessive and attached to her. The little one complained she had homework she was struggling with, because she's got zero talent for writing poems. Lee was thinking, writing poems is part of the noble life, but she didn't want to spend her whole life doing it. Cheyenne laughed, saying he went through studying poems and writing verses when he was a kid too. The butler suggested Lee chill out about writing the poem. If she doesn't get the whole tone thing yet, just sub in simple objects or sounds from her daily life. The kid was thinking about everyday stuff, but all that came to mind was different desserts. The guy cheered her on, saying writing a poem about chocolate cake would be awesome practice. Cheyenne said he took training courses at the temple after he ended up there from the orphanage. The girl was surprised the guy knew ancient literature and praised him for working so hard. Next to the girl was a book, and Cheyenne asked if she needed help with any of her assignments. The little one glanced at the book, wondering if the butler knew any children's stories. But since Cheyenne had been trained by priests, they weren't really into simple stuff, especially fairy tales. Lei noticed the butler getting all bummed out whenever he thought about his old life at the temple. The guy offered to help her read the book, but Lei was ready to tackle it on her own. The girl suggested that if he didn't know any kids' stories, he could just listen to her read it. That offer threw him for a loop. He didn't know how to react, and it kind of freaked the little one out. The guy started thinking about what would happen if the masters found out he was helping Lee, but figured he could handle the punishment. Cheyenne picked up the book, a story about the most wicked and righteous mages, super popular in the Empire. He checked out the book's description and realized the story was going to be about a magical kingdom. He pointed to the picture and asked Le if the character in it was a dark mage. The kid insisted a dark mage couldn't be from a duke's family, but Cheyenne reminded her that Cullen wasn't exactly an angel. The man opened the book, telling Le that the good mage in this book symbolized the start of a new life. Lee started reading the book aloud, and Cheyenne got lost in the story of a dark and light mage living in the same empire. Light mages were sorcerers who used the power of magic stones to become the strongest wizards. However, there were dark mages who used their magic to cause harm to ordinary people. Over time, the people of the empire rose up against the bad mages and decided to get rid of them. But among the bad mages, there were those who tried to hold on to their light side. One of these leaders for the mages was a dark mage named Luvelton. In the end, the mage Luvelton started fighting for the freedom of all the wronged mages. However, the light sorcerers also had a leader who opposed Luvelton, so the battle between the mages became known as the War of Vengeance. Even though it was a massive battle, the Empire won, and Luvelton took down the light sorcerer. His accomplices? They were executed. After that brutal war, the royal family banned mages from showing off their powers to regular folks. That's how the magic families formed, and only the kings tight with them. Lei closed the book on the final chapter, where it said all the bad mages got what was coming to them. The butler clapped for the little one, saying she read great and that her skills were way better now. Cheyenne thanked Lei, saying even though the story's famous all over the Empire, he still enjoyed hearing something new. Lei still wasn't used to getting so many compliments, but it was just part of life at the estate now, so she was getting used to it. Then, Lei looked at the book with a raised eyebrow and asked Xian if he didn't think the story was kinda weird. After thinking about it, the man and Lei realized the story did sound pretty harsh. Glancing at the picture in the book, Lei decided the authors could have made it a little cuter. Looking at the Duke's portrait, Xian admitted that the Duke was the first mage to side with humans, so some of the fairy tale is true. Since the Duke's basically royalty in name only, he's got crazy pull in the whole empire. Cullen's partnership with the king isn't just about him juicing the empire with magic. He's also got a license to print money with his businesses. Xian got up from the couch. He'd spent a lot of time with Lei, but now he needed to get back to work and get dinner going. The guy made the kids' day, promising chocolate cake for dessert. Lei went back to her homework, deciding to give writing a poem another shot, using Xian's advice. Grabbing her pencil, the little one started scribbling her thoughts. A little nervous, but super pumped. Though after a couple of words, her inspiration tanked, so she wasn't exactly thrilled. Liu stayed in the living room, figuring her talent would bloom eventually, and she'd nail that poem. But while she was working on the poem, she fell asleep, and only woke up when the Duke was carrying her to her bedroom. The guy shook his head, annoyed. He didn't like that, even after living at the estate for so long, his little girl still wasn't putting on enough weight for her age. Callan gently set Lo down, promising to measure her height to see if she was growing, even though he secretly wished she'd stay small forever. He made no secret of wanting Lo to stay with him always, never leaving the family estate. Callan left Lei on the bed, telling her to come down for dinner. Then he left the bedroom. He meant to head back to his study, but he turned and walked further down the hall. Passing the railing, the Duke cast a curious glance into the living room. The butler was reading some kind of letter when Callan called out to him. The Duke descended into the living room, his arrival making Xian nervously hide the paper. Callan didn't buy that the butler was okay, so he didn't rush off to another room. He noticed the servant's suspicious behavior and demanded he show him the paper. Xian was shaking with tension, claiming he just wanted to return Liu's homework, but Callan knew he'd already been checking out how well she'd done. Jade walked into the living room just as Xian started explaining he'd found the note on the pillow, but the Duke was already trying to snatch the assignment from him. Cullen grabbed the paper, and he and Jade started scrutinizing the contents. The paper had a poem with illustrations, and the first line said that Li really loved how Papa comes home to the sound of the carriage wheels. Li also loves the knock on the door when Jade comes to get her so they can play together, and how the clean dishes clink, because Xian will soon serve a delicious dinner. But the best thing in the whole estate is the chocolate cake that makes Li happy. After reading the poem, the Leveltons were horrified by how crooked the letters were and the unforgivable mistakes their little girl made on the assignment. Cullen decided to take action. He came up with the idea to invite more scholars so they could better unlock the genius talent in his daughter. Jade was analyzing the poem, and he was worried that Le might have gotten lazy towards the end of the assignment and didn't put in the proper effort. But despite all the flaws, the family decided they needed to preserve the girl's work and frame it. But Xian was trying to talk them out of telling the little one they'd seen her work. The Leveltons reread the poem, and now it seemed to them like the best piece of writing ever crafted by a master. Xian watched the men, but deep down, he anxiously wondered where their blatant admiration would lead. Jade waved the paper and asked his father to use magic to preserve it, like the most precious creation in their house. Cullen immediately turned to the butler, and in a menacing tone, reminded him that reading someone else's poems was extremely inappropriate, but no excuses helped Xian. Though the Duke was more offended that Xian was mentioned in the poem than that he had read it, Jade suddenly shouted that he didn't like that the first lines of the poem mentioned his father, and not him, since, as a brother, he plays with Letitia more. Cullen boasted that he was the powerhouse in their family, so he deserved the honored spot. But Xian reminded him that they better return the paper to the girl, or she'd be furious. The Duke was already imagining sending a copy of the poem to all the relatives and publishing it in the newspaper. But Xian assured him that after such plans, Letitia would be furious with him for life. Xian bowed as Cullen shot him a death glare, but reminded him that Lo wasn't ready for others to judge her work yet. Jade agreed that such a creation should stay within the walls of their estate, so he himself would go to Lu's room and praise her for her efforts. But Xian started telling the family they couldn't praise her too much, or they'd kill her talent before it even had a chance. The butler chilled out once he convinced the master, but decided to keep the drawing diary a secret, or Cullen would plaster it all over the newspaper for sure. A few days later, the truth about the poem reading came out, and the little one was absolutely fuming at the dinner table. Cullen wanted to know what was wrong, but Leah snapped back that she didn't love her dad or brother anymore. A heavy silence hung over the dining room, and it started to freak the Leveltons out. The Duke was on edge, trying to tell the kid she didn't mean what she said, but he knew he couldn't weasel his way out of it, so he threw Xian under the bus, saying, "He's the one who read the poem first." That just made Leah even angrier. She called her dad a liar, saying Xian would never do that to her, and the butler's heart just sank. Jade decided to defend the girl's love and shifted all the blame back to the father, even though it didn't exactly smooth things over. Leah didn't touch her food, spun around in her chair, and decided to ditch the dining room for some fresh air. Guys were checking her out as she walked away, but the little lady didn't even glance back. Back in her room, Lee tried to unleash all her rage, having a full-on brawl with her blanket. She screamed for ages and beat the crap out of that blanket. But it just made her angrier, not calmer. What really ticked Lee off was feeling so damn ashamed that someone had found out about her poem. Turns out the Leveltons were terrible at playing it cool. Jade brought up Lee memorizing her poem at their very first dinner together. But then, before dinner ended, Cullen promised chocolate cake would be a staple in their family, so Lee suspected they'd seen her homework. Lee poured a lot of heartache into that poem, but Cheyenne's advice helped her actually finish it. So finding out the truth like that, she was ready to mess up anyone who crossed her. After chilling in her room for a bit, she calmed down. Now that there'd be chocolate cake every day, she decided to wait till after dinner and pig out alone. A knock came at the bedroom door, and Cullen's voice echoed from the hallway. Letitia threw off the covers and smoothed them out a little on the bed. Then, she crept quietly to the door to listen to what was going on in the hallway. She almost grabbed the doorknob, but chickened out and stopped. La proudly pulled her hands away from the door and crossed her arms. On the other side of the door, Cullen heard the light patter of feet stop, so he decided to play it smart and told Lei he had some important info for her. The girl heard the muffled voice. She was curious, but a feeling of embarrassment kept her from approaching the door. Cullen knocked on the door again and whispered that his offer was something Le would really, really like. The little one grabbed the doorknob. She started to imagine they might go to the circus or a cafe. The Duke waited a bit, but when the door didn't open, he shouted that he was ready to take the little one to school. Le flung open the door, yelling at the man not to go anywhere and to wait for her. Cullen was leaning against the wall, so he was relieved when the girl finally came out of the room. The girl pretended to be open to hearing his offer about attending a private school after talking with her doctor. The man promised he had a way to get Lo enrolled during the school year, so it would be good for Lo to develop her writing skills around other students. Lo knew the schooling would be expensive, but turning down such an opportunity would be wrong. Cullen figured his offer hadn't impressed Lee, so he was about to leave. But the little one grabbed his shirt. The man said that she could join the class for 2 months now, and then decide if she wanted to keep studying science. The little one let go of his shirt, and holding back her emotions, agreed to go to school. But she had one condition. Her father had to apologize for reading her poem without permission. Cullen grimaced. He'd never apologized to anyone in his entire life. Those words stunned the girl, because now he might change his mind, since Lo's behavior had become too free after being accepted into the family. The Duke scooped Le up in his arms, promising to learn how to apologize so he could make his daughter the happiest girl ever. Le was touched when the man apologized for going overboard. The girl squinted, making sure he was really sorry, and not just because he got caught messing up. Cullen showered Lo with compliments, promising to treat her like a proper gentleman. As her dad, he's invested in everything she does, but he'll respect her boundaries from now on. But he was worried if Lee still loved him after he messed up, so the little girl had to reassure him. The Duke relaxed, relieved that his little girl wasn't mad at him anymore. Night fell over the estate, but Lo kept peppering the Duke with questions about who would be going to school with her. The estate was buzzing with activity the next morning, as the maids scrambled to find the perfect outfit for the girl's first day of school. Marianne arrived to help with the preparations, but she wasn't digging the outfits the servants were choosing. The last dress made the kid look like a priest. Cullen and Jade were waiting in the room. The man could hear the shouts of frustration from the dressing room, but he encouraged Mariana to find the best outfit for such an important event. Finally done with these exhausting preparations, Marianne squealed with delight. They dressed the little one in a light green dress, which looked incredibly adorable with her pink hair. The maid wanted to braid a ribbon into her hair, but Madame ordered a voluminous hairstyle so the other students wouldn't think Lei was a baby. The girl examined the jewelry box and decided she should try on a hairpin. Marianne picked out a hairpin that matched the dress and clipped it into Lei's hair. Cullen was already losing his patience. He couldn't wait to show the other kids from high society how beautiful his daughter was. His sister reined Cullen in, because you need to make the right impression on the first day of school, or else problems could arise later. The Duke finished reading the newspaper when Le asked to be allowed to wear Marianne's outfit, because Madame always has excellent taste in everything. Marianne covered Lo's cheek with kisses, because the girl always knew how to give the best compliments. The girl sat Lo down in front of the mirror and advised her to make friends on her very first day. As the girl brushed her hair, Lei thought about how Walter was the only friend she'd ever had, so she was still worried about him. Marianne decorated her hair with a hairpin, but reminded the little one that the school she'd be attending was for nobles, so it might be different from a regular one. The Duke exclaimed that it was Madame Pauline's prestigious school, which shocked his sister. She grilled her brother about what he had to do to pull some strings and get her a spot in that class. Marianne was anxious until she found out which school they were talking about, but now she felt much calmer. The little one peeked out from behind the mirror. The family's behavior suggested that the school was pretty well known. The servants picked out a coat for the girl that matched her green dress, making her look even more stunning. Cullen took Lou's hand and led her towards the exit. They needed to hit the road so they wouldn't be late for the start of classes. Lee waved goodbye to Jade and promised she'd be home soon. The family carriage left the estate and headed down the snowy road towards the school. Lee had a ton of questions about school, especially making friends, but Marianne remembered there were only a few dozen students. The kid started tapping her foot, all nervous, when the madame explained that schooling was super strict and depended on your noble family's status. The school just reeked of aristocracy, so Lee was worried if she could even fit in. Marianne was surprised her brother didn't pick up on their daughter's hints, and reminded him there were always other schools that might be a better fit. Cullen just flat out said that only the most prestigious place was good enough for his talented daughter. Lee wasn't even listening. She'd never been to school before, so she was stressing about keeping up with everything, but the madame promised they tailor their teaching to each student. Marianne hesitated when Lee wanted to know more about those methods. The carriage pulled up to the school courtyard, so Marianne only had time to admit that all the students are from royal families, or close to them. Madame Pauline had been waiting for the new student since morning, so she personally greeted the Duke's family. Cullen didn't hold back, declaring his daughter was the best student for this place. Then he threatened, saying he really hoped she'd be treated right. That attitude kinda cracked Madame up, 'cause the rumors about the Duke's change in behavior were totally true. The woman saw through Cullen's plan, but he told her to keep an eye on his daughter discreetly. Madame glanced at the young lady, but she was standing next to Cullen, not moving an inch. Getting her bearings, the little one curtsied and introduced herself as Letitia. Lo's manners touched Madame. She promised the girl would have a teacher assigned today, and in the meantime, she could make some new friends. The little girl was thrilled about the teacher news. Then, Madame suggested they head to the classroom to meet the other students. Madame Pauline bowed to Marianne, saying it was an honor to meet the saint of their temple. As was proper, Marianne returned the bow, because Madame Pauline was a person from a noble family whom she hadn't seen in ages. Madame walked past the Leveltons, her voice turning stern, assuring the Duke she'd find ways to take care of the young lady. Lee was blown away by how regal the woman carried herself. She just radiated noble lady vibes. But then Marianne whispered something that dropped Lee's jaw. Madame Pauline was actually a dude. Total shocker. The madam turned to Letitia and invited her to come to class with her. The family said their goodbyes to the little one, and as Lee waved, the Duke promised to pick her up that evening. The Leveltons weren't in a hurry to leave, and watched as the madam led Lee down another hallway. The school hallway was empty. Madame gave her the lowdown. Lee's classmates were all the same age, so if she hit it off with them, she could study with them until graduation. The news about having classmates her age cheered Lee up, and by the time they reached the classroom door, she wasn't so scared anymore. The madam went into the classroom, pushing aside any lingering doubts that the students might be different from her old friends. Lee followed right behind. The woman introduced Lee to the students, but the girl decided to show some manners too, and with a bow, reminded them that she was also the daughter of Duke Cullen Levelton. A bunch of kids crowded around the girl, not rushing to introduce themselves, so Madame Pauline suggested they all have tea together during the break. The classroom door slammed shut behind Madame, but the silence in the room lingered. One of the students asked, all skeptical-like, if Lee was really a Duke's daughter. The student introduced herself as Levine, her blonde hair styled in fancy curls, and her dress was a rare dark blue. Levine got right up in the girl's face, but Lee stayed cheerful and introduced herself back. Levine was all demanding, firing off questions that needed quick answers. She let Lee know she was now in a class with the most elite kids under 14. Levine tossed her head, proudly declaring that most of their class belonged to the royal family, but with Lee's knack for numbers, she figured out only 2 of them were actually royalty. The student kept grilling Lee, now asking with a sneer why she was even at this school in the first place. Lee could tell Levine wasn't a real threat, so she stayed gentle and just suggested she ask the adults how she got into the school. That tone made Levine bristle, because she was used to everyone jumping when she said so, not being told to go find out herself. The girl turned away with a sniff and a snide promise that since the Duke himself sent Lee there, they'd take pity on her and not kick her out, even if their skills were way better. But before Lo could answer, Lavin pointed a finger at her and, in a shrill voice, told her to follow their rules. The student was convinced that noble blood was the key to the world's future, so Lee needed to know her place. Le no longer thought there was any difference between kids from the streets and those from private schools, so she agreed with Lavin about the future of noble families. Not. Lavin, puffed up with her little victory, decided to enlighten Le on the finer points of dealing with their clique. The girl announced that they were putting on a play at the royal palace during the annual festival, but Lo didn't react at all, which pissed Lavin off. She started screaming hysterically that only those who play the lead roles in the play are destined for success in society. Lavin yelled that her mother was certain of the play's importance, but Lee already knew that kind of motherly advice wasn't for her. The girl kept bragging about her noble lineage, so she decided she couldn't give Lee a role in the upcoming production, since she wasn't even from a good family. Lo figured out that Lavin was scared of losing the lead role, but she still wasn't interested in the production, so she promised not to try out for a part. The rejection surprised the students. They were worried about what Lo would do while the others were rehearsing. The girl picked up the script from the floor. She'd read tons of books in her past life, so she could put that experience to good use. Lo smiled sweetly and offered to help out with the script. That offer freaked Levine out. She had no clue what a script editor even did. The other students started whispering to each other, until one, the boldest, tried to ask what the editor's job was. Levine clapped a hand over her friend's mouth so they wouldn't look like total dummies. But Lo had already read a few lines of the script and immediately suggested changes. The girl pointed out the complicated phrases in the text and suggested replacing them with simpler ones so they'd be easy to memorize. The kids crowded around Lu. She noticed the play was similar to a book she'd read before, so she easily suggested alternative lines to the students. After processing the suggestion, one of the students was shocked that the newbie could interpret the text on her first day. Levine's friend asked again to explain the meaning of a word, to which Levine jumped towards her, and in an even more menacing tone, began to explain that Le had merely reimagined a classic story for modern times. Lee bragged that she had a certificate from a doctor who discovered her talent for language science, so ordinary acting wasn't interesting to her. She was fully capable of controlling the entire preparation process for the play. The students started whispering again that Le decided to become more important than the actors and take the position of theater consultant, and the quiet gossip only made Levine angrier. Levine called everyone to a meeting, and the girls stepped aside, quietly whispering in a circle. The girl began to turn the students against Lee, because she's just a commoner who dared to invade the sphere of responsibility of noble aristocrats. The girls started arguing that they can't do anything about Lei, because she's very sweet and can win the hearts of many. The argument flared up even more. Levine convinced others that no status of the Duke's family will hide Lu's poor origins, and she must be kicked out. Although the students tried to discuss everything quietly, Lee could clearly hear all their plans concerning her. Levine was angry that now her friends are trying to make excuses, because initially they were all against Le, so as not to lose their status as nobles. Suddenly, one of the girls stated that Lee was involved in the Duke dumping Lady Rose, so she's dangerous. However, when the secret information stopped being secret, the student was afraid that she had said too much. Lee didn't hear the whole sentence, but now she was heading towards her classmates with a firm step so that they would tell her everything they had discussed. Lavin tried to shield the girls, her voice shaking, but then she blurted out that she knew the whole scandalous truth about Letitia's behavior. Apparently, at some fancy party, Lavine overheard a rumor that Letitia's pulling the Duke's strings, using him to disrespect noble ladies. Lee started thinking about Lady Rose, who, way back when, tried to sell her off to some traveling sideshow. So, after all that, Lady Rose didn't clean up her act, and she's still spreading juicy gossip about the Duke's family among the rich kids. Lou couldn't change how her classmates saw her. The rumors were too strong. So she just went to the window and let the girls have their meeting. The kid watched the snowy courtyard, realizing she wouldn't make any high society friends today, even though Cullen swore she'd like it here. Lee wanted to focus on the school's academics, but after hearing about the upcoming tea party, all she could think about was what kind of sweets there'd be. Lavin cleared her throat dramatically, grabbing everyone's attention, and announced that they had a solution. The girl decided to be blunt. For fancy kids like them, hanging out with a commoner like Lou is beneath them, and the Levelton family's status doesn't change that. Lo felt stung by the words. She clenched her fists, trying to keep it together, because she already knew she could never replace the Duke's real daughter. Lavin smirked and said that Lee could only join their clique if she did everything they asked. Lavin's friend mentioned there's a pet parade in the Central Park greenhouse on Saturday. The girl mysteriously sidled up to Lee, wanting to know if she had a pet. Lavin mocked Lee for not having a pet, and even when everyone burst out laughing, she kept saying that even with a pet, they'd never invite her. The girl started listing all the events they had planned for the week, so unless Lee was in their circle, she'd miss all the parties and activities. But Lavin jumped in front of Lee and offered her a deal. Do whatever they say for a month, and then she might get a chance to hang with the cool kids. The girl tried to convince Lee that her offer was the best option for a poor little orphan like her. Then Lavin laid out a bunch more rules, starting with Lee having to be the first one in class and the last one out. She'd have to write super sincere letters to Levine's closest friends and give them presents. But the most important thing was that Lee couldn't refuse any request the girls gave her. Those rules really ticked off Lee, but Levine was stoked. She thought she'd come up with the perfect way for a commoner girl to make new friends. The little girl's face went red with anger. She realized these girls were no better than her, especially since they barely spent any time studying. Trying to stay calm, Lo asked to make sure she understood the deal. When Levine saw Lo was interested, she sweetly kept pushing how important this decision was. Lei decided to stand her ground and declared that playing with her brother at home was way better than what these girls were offering, so she was out. Levine couldn't believe her ears, but behind her, the whispers started up again. Lo walked right past Levine, saying she wouldn't let anyone turn her into a servant. Even if they were friends, she wouldn't agree to that garbage. Levine was furious, her fists clenched and shaking. The girl's face flushed. Now she was sure this commoner had no class, and Lee wasn't worth offering a deal to, not even once. Lo walked to her desk without looking back. even though Levine was having a total meltdown behind her, held back by a couple of her friends. The little girl put her backpack on the desk. She tried to chill out, but now she knew for sure. Getting along with aristocrats just wasn't her thing. True to his word, the Duke showed up at the school right after classes ended. The man picked up the little one, but as they stepped into the courtyard, Le glanced back at the school building. She spotted some classmates in one of the windows, watching her leave. Le found the aristo's behavior amusing. The carriage set off for the Levelton estate, and on the way, Cullen eagerly asked the girl about her first day. It was important to him to know who Lo had befriended, but she just brushed it off, saying she spent the time exploring the school. Cullen sensed something was off when Le mentioned they had a tea party. Lei wasn't being straight with her dad when he tried to find out if she liked the school, but her trembling hands didn't escape Cullen's notice. He saw that the little one looked like she was about to burst into tears any second. Lei shook her head. She didn't want to admit that, because of their different social standings, she'd become an embarrassment to the Levelton family name on her very first day. She wasn't about to jeopardize her dad's trust, so she repeated that everything was fine. The girl turned to the window, but he didn't like that, and tried to turn her back around. Even though Cullen was trying to stay calm, a dark aura started to build around him. He patted Lee on the shoulder, hinting that she should tell the truth. After thinking for a second, the little one confessed that her classmates told her she couldn't come to the pet party on Saturday. The Duke was about to blow his top, but Lee thought fast and added that she couldn't go, only because she didn't have a pet. The man didn't get it, but Lee tried to explain that she wasn't ready to raise an animal just to go to some tea party. The little girl promised she'd rather spend the weekend with family than with a bunch of kids she didn't know. But then she worried that Cullen might be busy on Saturday, and the day would go by without him. The man suggested Lee could do both things on the weekend, since the day was long, and after the tea party, she could come home and spend time with family. Callan wrapped a warm scarf around the little girl's neck and cheered her up by saying he had a pet she'd really like. But Lee had never seen animals at home, though it made sense why Cheyenne always told her not to play in the woods, where there might be critters. The Duke assured the little one she'd go to tea with his pet, since she's part of the Duke's family and can go anywhere without an invite. Callan was flattered that his status was so respected, and sometimes people even burst into tears of joy when they meet him. So Lee definitely had to go to the event and give others a chance to see a lady of the Duke's family. Just in case, Lee asked if the animal was a giant spider, but Callan promised the pet was super cute and everyone would love it. The little girl calmed down. She decided to trust her dad, since he definitely wouldn't tame some wild beast. A few days passed, and Saturday arrived. A carriage pulled up to the estate to take Lee to the tea party in the conservatory. The little girl came down to the hall and then screamed in terror when she finally saw Callan's pet. The man introduced the animal, named Fifi, and suggested Lee pet it often to keep Fifi calm. Cheyenne offered to swap the pet for another from the woods if Lee didn't like Fifi. The butler joked that you can't just marry someone who lives in the water, but you could always hit up the zoo and snag that elephant the Duke got from overseas. Lee wasn't thrilled about bringing an elephant to tea, so she passed. Cheyenne promised that Fifi doesn't bite, and the young lady would be perfectly safe. The man nudged Lee towards the exit, or she'd be late for the event. Jade came down the stairs, decked out in a sharp black formal suit. Lee was impressed by her brother's outfit, but she had no idea where he was going. All the guys were acting secretive. Sure, Lee was bummed her classmates ignored her, but she wasn't exactly trying to be their best friend either. Jade hauled Lee to the carriage. He decided to tag along to help her out with the other students. The guy smirked, all cocky, and promised that having an older guy around makes these things way better. The carriage pulled up to a glass greenhouse, where they could already hear people chatting. The girls brought their fluffy friends, who sat on cushions while their owners gossiped about noble nonsense. Suddenly, a menacing roar echoed through the entire greenhouse, scattering the little pets and sending the classmates scrambling in terror. The girls stopped sipping their tea and stared anxiously at the main entrance of the greenhouse. But the closer the source of the wild roar got, the paler their faces became. Letitia strolled along the garden path, carefully holding a massive tiger on a golden chain. But then the tiger bolted towards the table, so Letitia couldn't hold him back and lost her grip on the leash. The girls jumped up and scrambled to find cover. The classmates huddled in a corner. Levine tried to hide behind the other girls, but they were so crammed against the wall that they couldn't move. Letitia managed to grab the leash, and after sitting the tiger down beside her, introduced the animal as her dad's pet, named Fifi. Levine was about to pass out from fear, because the tiger was standing right in front of her. But the second the girl mentioned the Duke, the tiger growled again, getting right up in her face and scaring her half to death. Levine dropped to her knees, begging Letitia to keep the wild beast from eating her. Jade walked in, smirking that Princess Levine was throwing the most boring pet meet and greet ever, so he wasn't interested in sticking around. Jade showing up distracted Levine from the tiger, and she focused all her attention on him. But right then, Lei was in total shock, because it turned out she'd been beefing with a real-life princess all week at school. Lei was super embarrassed about what happened, and all she wanted was to just disappear into thin air. Jade approached the princess, faking sincerity and thanking her for being kind to his sister. The princess started lying, saying they couldn't become friends with Letitia because Jade's sister didn't want to. Jade knew all the royal gossip, so he advised the princess to be careful and smart if she wanted to stay in the royal family, especially being so far down the line for the throne. The guy leaned in close to the princess and promised that, unlike her, the duke only had one daughter, so if their families started feuding, the king wouldn't value one of many princesses. Jade smirked, hinting that Levine should get a grip and behave herself from now on. My brother turned to Leah and asked her to greet her new friends. Jade was finding this whole thing hilarious, joking that the friends were so happy to see Leah that they were crying tears of joy. Leah wasn't thrilled, though. She knew Jade was part of the duchy, but didn't realize he was so good at playing these high-society kids. The realization that she was also part of the duchy made her heart pound with the tension of the situation. The little one hugged Fifi and thanked Lavinia for being kind to her, even though Leah didn't know about her princess status. Then, Leah smiled sweetly and suggested they nurture their friendship in the future. Levine couldn't believe that some commoner was offering to be friends with a princess. Fifi started to growl softly. Leah stroked the pet's fur and decided these girls weren't going to change, so she agreed with her brother that the tea party was a total drag. The little one turned around, picked up Fifi, and headed for the exit, because she still wanted to spend time with her family today. After a moment, Lee glanced back at Lavin and suggested that from now on, they could at least try smiling at each other when they meet. That small comment really ticked off the princess, but she stayed put in the corner of the greenhouse while the other girls tried to take her mind off things. Lee noticed that after talking with her brother, the princess wasn't quite as quick to hurl insults. The family, along with Fifi, headed for the exit. But now Lo got a real taste of what it's like to be a duke's daughter, the kind people are afraid of. The carriage set off back towards the Levelton estate. Fifi sprawled out on the floor of the carriage, taking up almost all the space. But La thought the tiger was just too cute. Suddenly, the tiger twisted around and clamped his teeth onto the hem of her coat. Lei was still intimidated by the sheer number of fangs the tiger had, so whenever he opened his mouth, it scared her a little. Jade told Lei to scratch Fifi's belly. Apparently, the tiger uses his teeth to get attention when he wants some affection. Lee wondered how her father had managed to tame a pet like that, and Jade explained that dark magic users have incredible hypnotic abilities. Fifi showed up at the Duke's place a year ago, after Cullen rescued the poor thing from some poachers. So, once the tiger was back on its feet, it just kinda took to Cullen, started acting like he was the owner. Lee stroked the tiger's fur, deciding it definitely wasn't dangerous. The animal's coat was super soft and gleaming in the sun, so for a second, Lee even thought about giving it a sniff. But Jade was totally thrown off by this, and it raised a bunch of questions in his mind. Lee started hugging the animal. Her actions made her brother believe just how fearless she was. The little girl giggled, but if her family said the tiger wasn't dangerous, then she shouldn't worry. Lee confessed that she's scared of what the future holds, since Lavine is a princess, and she's a nobody. The fallout could be rough, but Lee's already figured she might have to drop out of school. Now that her classmates are freaked out by the Duke, they won't mess with her, so they'll avoid her in every class. Jade was bragging about how he'd make everyone leave the school if he had to, or Lee could just pick a different place. But the guy also threatened that if she kept the school teasing from him, he'd be forced to, well, let's just say he'd be very disappointed. The little one stared at her brother, surprised. But he's the second in command of the family, so he can take action. Lee tried to calm down and just thanked him for making time for her today. Since joining the family, Lee's changed. She used to think she couldn't do anything about the kids' bad behavior. Even if she tried to be nice, offering attention and gifts, it wouldn't have fixed anything, because no amount of gifts can change the fact that they're from different walks of life. So now, with so many people in the duchy caring about her, she can't afford to just cowardly take any kind of flack. Lee looked at the estate grounds coming up. She's not the same person who can be easily discarded anymore. The time has come when the winter scenery outside the window doesn't look so cold to her. She looked at Jade, realizing she finally had people who valued her and were giving her a chance to change. And that's what gave her the strength to be confident, no matter what. The carriage was almost at the estate. Lee still had a lot of challenges ahead, but they didn't seem so scary anymore, now that she had the support she needed so badly.